Chapter 31. Damn Dao Ba, what did you just say? Say it again for me to hear? Surrounded by more than 10 burly men in the narrow alley, the handsome scholar looked disdainfully at the leader of the group, Dao Ba. His voice was clearly transmitted to everyone's ears. The people behind Dao Ba were stunned. They didn't dare to believe that at this moment, this scholar actually dared to say such words. Was he not afraid of death? It should be known that the boss hated it when people mentioned the word Dao Ba in front of him. Quietly looking at the boss's ashen face, everyone couldn't help but take a step back. They were worried that the scene that was about to happen would be too cruel and bloody. What did you just say? Say it again? Dao Ba looked at Li Yi with an ashen face. His eyes flashed with a dangerous glint. It's fine if you're ugly, but to think that there's something wrong with your ears as well. Just what kind of beliefs have supported you to live until now? Li Yi looked at the scarred man with a pitiful gaze and said with some pity, "What kind of belief has supported me to live until now?" The people behind Dao Ba were stunned when they heard this. They didn't immediately understand the meaning of this sentence. When it came to scolding people, as a young man of the 21st century, Li Yi's level was clearly several streets ahead of the people of this era. These ruffians who hadn't even read a book, who knew how many brain cells had died. It took a while for them to understand the meaning of this sentence. Afterwards, everyone looked at Li Yi with a strange expression. In their eyes there was actually a faint kind of worship? This scholar's mouth was too poisonous. These ruffians of the ancient times were usually full of profanities, but it was just trash, stupid pig, and other vulgar words that didn't have any technical difficulty. Those with a little bit of cultural literacy might say a few words in classical Chinese, such as your mother's maid, your mother is a concubine, and so on, but who would take swearing to such a high level? What kind of belief has supported you to live until now? There wasn't a single profanity in this sentence, but if one were to talk about the meaning, it was more profound than all the swearing. This was simply raising swearing to a new level. Courting death. The scarred man's face had long since turned red. Li Yi's words had successfully aroused his anger, making him want to immediately destroy this scholar in front of him and completely disappear from this world. As he roared, he clenched his fist and smashed it toward Li Yi's face. The 2-meter-tall man had an incomparably sturdy physique. One of his arms was as thick as Li Yi's thigh. The muscles on his exposed arms were bulging, and his sandbag-sized fists carried a whistling sound full of momentum. If this full-force punch really landed on Li Yi's face, he would probably have to go through another glorious transmigration. However, the man's fist did not land on Li Yi's face in the end. The long sword on his neck was like a bucket of cold water poured on his head, extinguishing all the anger in the man's heart. His fist stopped in midair, and beads of cold sweat rolled down his forehead. Hiss! The surrounding people sucked in a breath of cold air and couldn't help but take a few steps back. Their faces were pale as they looked at the beautiful woman who had appeared out of nowhere and held a cold sword on their boss's neck. The cold light of the long sword was cold and incomparably sharp. It was likely that the woman holding the long sword would cut off the scarred man's head with just a little bit of force. Big brother. When did she come over? Who are you? Quickly let go of our big brother. Heroine, let's talk this out. The group of subordinates wanted to save the scarred man, but they didn't dare to act rashly. They could only stand there fearfully, not daring to take a step closer to the beautiful woman. The one who was the most frightened at this moment was, of course, the scarred man with the long sword on his neck. In the hot weather, the cold long sword was placed on his neck. Feeling the sharpness of the sword, the scarred man suddenly felt a chill from head to toe. He stood there motionlessly, afraid that if he turned his head would fall to the ground. Heroine, spare me, spare me. At this moment he couldn't care less about his face in front of his brothers. His eyes were filled with fear, and his face was pale as he spoke in a trembling voice. What dignity! What face! How could these things be more important than his life? Li Yi was very satisfied with Lu Rui's timely arrival. Although this sister-in-law was often unreliable and would only cause trouble for him, she was quite reliable at critical moments. At this moment, Lu Rui didn't care about the man's begging for mercy. Instead, she looked at Li Yi with a strange expression, as if she was seeing him for the first time. No one knew what she was thinking. Li Yi was a little frightened by her gaze. He hurriedly looked away, and when he looked at the scarred man again, a trace of anger appeared on his face and he kicked his butt. Robbery? Robbery? That's what you get for not learning well. The dozen ruffians behind the scarred man glared at Li Yi angrily when they saw their big brother being humiliated by the weak scholar, but no one dared to act rashly. As for the scarred man, he only felt an unprecedented sense of humiliation in his heart. He wanted to tear the scholar into pieces, but he could only endure it because the sword was still on his neck. Stop fighting, let's go. After Li Yi kicked him a few times, Lu Rui looked away from his face. Li Yi only felt a blur in front of his eyes, and her sword had returned to its scabbard. Li Yi was stunned for a moment, and he immediately retreated to Lu Rui's side. Then he felt terrible. He had been so confident earlier because he had a hostage in his hands. Now that the sword on the scarred man's neck was gone, could Lu Rui deal with so many ruffians alone? After feeling the sword on his neck disappear, the scarred man suddenly took 2 steps forward, and returned to the middle of the ruffians. He reached out his hand to touch his neck, only to realize that there was a blood stain on his hand. A trace of fear and lingering fear appeared on his face, followed by endless anger. He pointed his finger at Li Yi and Lu Rui, revealing his white teeth, and said fiercely, "Go! Break the scholar's legs. Remember not to hurt the woman." The ruffians behind him rolled up their sleeves, and their eyes were filled with murderous intent. When they looked at Lu Rui, their eyes swept over her body, and they couldn't help but lick their lips, and a trace of greed appeared in their eyes. Lu Rui's pretty face did not change as she watched the ruffians approach, but there was a faint trace of mockery and disdain in the depths of her eyes. "Son-in-law, second lady, so you're here?" At this moment, a rough voice suddenly rang out from the alley. Chapter 32. Just when Li Yi was worried that Lu Rui would not be able to deal with these ruffians, Mr. Fang appeared at the entrance of the alley just in time. The burly man surnamed Fang was not alone. The other men who had come down from the stronghold with him were also by his side. "Get out of here. This is none of your business." At this time, the scar-faced man was unable to restrain his anger. Suddenly, he saw a group of idlers appear at the entrance of the alley. He coldly berated them and was about to personally break the legs of the scholar who had just kicked him in the butt in front of so many of his brothers, causing him to lose all face. "Get out of here. If you don't, I'll beat you too." Seeing that the few Tian Shihan were still standing at the entrance of the alley even though their big brother had already given the order, he immediately yelled out in anger and walked towards the burly man surnamed Fang. There were more than 10 people on their side, and the number of people on the other side was less than half of their number. The young man was not afraid when he walked over. He pointed at Mr. Fang's nose and scolded, "What are you still doing here? Hurry up." He swallowed the word, "get out," before he could say it. To be precise, he was kicked back by Mr. Fang. Although he hadn't figured out what was going on, this group of ignorant ruffians was obviously looking for trouble with the son-in-law and the second Mississippi. How could the burly man surnamed Fang be polite to them? He lifted his foot and kicked them. A figure suddenly flew from the entrance of the alley. He crossed a distance of 2 or 3 feet and smashed into the crowd. 2 people were instantly knocked down to the ground. They struggled for a long time but could not get up. The sudden turn of events caused the entire place to fall silent. Li Yi stared blankly at the young man who was kicked 5 or 6 meters away by Mr. Fang. He was a little stunned. To be honest, he had only seen such a scene in action movies in his life. However, movies were just movies. When he saw such a scene in reality, the shock in his heart was still indescribable. That man who had always looked simple and honest was actually so strong? Li Yi was not the only one who was stunned. The scar-faced man and his group of ruffians were also stunned. Seeing their underlings being kicked away and lying on the ground, unable to get up, after a short moment of shock, everyone's expressions became fierce. However, as vicious as they were, there were others who were even more vicious than them. The burly man surnamed Fang couldn't hold it in any longer. He shouted at the top of his lungs and rushed forward like a bull. "Are you blind? How dare you bully our Willow Leaf village? You even dare to find trouble with second young mistress and young master? You must be tired of living. It's been a long time since I've fought with anyone. My body is itching." "I finally made it this time." Almost in the next second, several men behind the burly man surnamed Fang also rushed forward. Their faces were full of excited expressions, and they were quite eager to have a try. As a mountain bandit, they had always been the ones bullying others. When had they ever been bullied by others? Although they had been good for a long time, the aggressive nature in their bones couldn't be erased. Before those ruffians could react, several people had already rushed in front of them. "Fight without a word." At this moment, Li Yi deeply understood the meaning of this sentence. The burly man was like a tiger in a flock of sheep. When they raised their hands and chopped down, there would be one person lying on the ground. Their movements were bold and beautiful. This was a complete crushing of strength. In just a dozen breaths of time, everyone, including the scar-faced man, was lying on the ground. They were either holding their arms or legs, crying and shouting for their parents. On the contrary, the burly man surnamed Fong and his group were not red or out of breath. There was no sweat on their foreheads. They stood there and rubbed their palms. Their eyes swept back and forth among the ruffians lying on the ground, as if they wanted to continue. Bang! The scar-faced man had just used his hands to prop himself up. After the burly man surnamed Fong kicked him, he lay on the ground and didn't dare to move again. Bah! Several people spat on the ground at the same time, their eyes full of contempt. Li Yi understood the meaning in the eyes of the burly man surnamed Fong and his group. You scum with less than 5 battle power, you don't even have the qualifications to make this or take action. He watched as the usually smiling, straightforward, and honest men turned into super scions one by one, completely different from the people he knew before. They were just a group of farmers, but they actually had two faces. Even Li Yi had begun to suspect whether this group of people had a split personality or something. However, this was not important for the time being. Under the puzzled gazes of the burly man surnamed Fong and his group, Li Yi jogged over to the ruffians lying on the ground and skillfully fished out a few copper coins, a few silver coins and a few copper coins from their pockets. At this moment he was thinking that since the other party wanted his silver, they would naturally have to pay the same price. This group of poor people didn't even bring more money when they came out. This bit of money wasn't even enough to compensate him for the mental damage. Li Yi, who was busy collecting the mental damage compensation, didn't know that the burly man surnamed Fong and the others behind him were watching his skillful movements with their mouths agape. Damn, this awareness, this technique. Who the F***ck is the real bandit here? In a short while there were already many people outside the alley. Since ancient times, those who were watching a good show would never complain about things getting bigger. In this era where entertainment wasn't abundant, even if it was a fight, there would be people watching it as a good show. Watching a few unfamiliar men beat up the famous ruffians of this generation to the ground, the crowd was shocked, but also felt incomparably carefree and couldn't help but cheer loudly. Warrior, well fought. What a delightful sight. This group of ruffians should have had this day a long time ago. What are you all crowding around here for? Out of the way, out of the way. The bailiffs are here. After a burst of noise, a few people wearing the uniforms of bailiffs with weapons in their hands squeezed in from outside. When they saw the situation in the alley, they shouted loudly and ran inside. The bailiffs are here, let's retreat. Seeing this, the burly man surnamed Fong laughed loudly and sprinted to the corner of the wall. With a leap, he used the tip of his toes to push off the wall twice and climbed up the high wall with one hand. In the time of 2 breaths, he had already disappeared over the top of the wall. Second miss, I'll leave the son-in-law to you. The rest of the people also laughed and imitated the burly man surnamed Fong, climbing up the wall like nimble monkeys. In his heart, Li Yi was still amazed at the speed at which they climbed up the wall. If they were in the modern era, they would definitely be outstanding neighbors. Just as he was feeling extremely envious, he suddenly felt his shoulder tighten, and his whole body flew up as light as a feather. Lu Rui grabbed onto Li Yi's shoulder and with a light leap, the two of them were already standing on the top of the wall. With another tap of their toes, they disappeared from the eyes of the crowd. The bailiffs watched helplessly as Li Yi and the others climbed over the wall and left. Standing there, they could only look at the wall and sigh. It couldn't be helped. With their skills, there was no way they could climb such a high wall. Chapter 33. Where are they? The constables were looking at the wall, not knowing how to chase after them. Suddenly, a voice came from behind them. Hearing this voice, everyone felt as if they had been granted amnesty. They turned their heads and pointed at the high wall behind them, saying weakly, "They ran away." Ran away? Why aren't you chasing after them? The woman wearing the uniform of a constable with a saber hanging from her waist glared at the constables. With a light leap, she was already on top of the wall. Just as she was about to chase after them, the constables below were shocked and hurriedly shouted, "Boss, wait. Is there anything else?" The female constable turned around and asked with a frown. One of the constables immediately said, "There are too many of them. It's too dangerous for the boss to go alone. Call a few more brothers later and we'll definitely be able to catch them." "Yes, boss." Everyone obviously didn't want the female constable to chase after them. At this moment, another constable stepped forward and pointed at the ruffian who was still lying on the ground, saying, "What should we do with these people? Should we send them to the clinic first?" The woman glanced at the knife-scarred man and the others. She did not hide the disgust on her face and coldly said, "They are not good people either. Capture them first and lock them up. We'll talk after we interrogate them. When the constables heard this, their faces all turned bitter. Usually, when they encountered street fights like this, if the circumstances were not serious, they would be punished and punished. This kind of thing happened a few times a day. If they were arrested and sent to the prison cell every time, wouldn't they, as constables, be busy to death? However, even though they were extremely unwilling, they still had to obediently carry out this lady's order. Not to mention her status as a constable, they were supposed to be under her jurisdiction. Even the county magistrate had to be polite to her, let alone them who were just mere constables. Dejectedly, she walked to the ruffian who was still howling on the ground and kicked him hard. "Get up and follow us back to the county yamen." The development of the situation had taken a turn. The scarred man and the other ruffians were dumbfounded. They couldn't figure out how these constables handled cases. This time they were clearly the victims, okay? Seeing that these constables had no room for negotiation, they felt as if they had eaten Chinese gold thread, bitter. He looked at these constables with resentment in his eyes. His heart was filled with resentment. You guys are abusing your power. You guys are handling the case recklessly. You guys are blind. One was happy while the other was sad. The ruffians were taken away dejectedly, but the onlookers couldn't help but cheer. Obviously these people had been bullied by them a lot. "This time I'll let you off for now." The valiant and formidable-looking female constable stood on top of the wall. She glanced in a certain direction and leaped down lightly. A constable trotted over with a fawning look on his face. "Boss, they've all been brought back." Outside the prefectural city at a tea stall by the roadside. With Lu Rui grabbing onto his shoulder and flying over countless walls, Li finally witnessed what it meant to be able to leap onto roofs and vault over walls. He was a little afraid of heights, so he still had a lingering fear. When he finally got out of the city and sat down to calm himself down, the familiar voice of the man surnamed Fong came from the side. "Son-in-law, why did those ruffians come for you?" Even now, the man surnamed Fong was still curious about this matter. Generally speaking, if one was targeted by those ruffians, it was either because they were rich or because they were colored. These two, if those ruffians liked men, then what happened just now would be easy to explain. Although the young master didn't have much money, even the man surnamed Fong couldn't deny that in the eyes of those with special hobbies, the young master was probably a rare beauty. What's so strange about that? "They wanted to rob me." Li glanced at the man surnamed Fong and said, "Ha!" The man surnamed Fong and the others were stunned at first, but then they laughed honestly. Their faces clearly showed that they didn't believe him at all. Those ruffians also had proper business to do. So many people were gathered there just to rob a few copper coins? They had never seen such idle ruffians. It seemed like it was really because of the second reason. The man surnamed Fong thought in his heart with absolute certainty. This time even Lu Rui looked at Li Yi with a slightly mocking expression. This obvious expression of disbelief dealt a huge blow to Li Yi's self-esteem. Lu Rui was fine, but Li Yi was already used to it. Even these ruffians dared to look down on him. Why would he tell them that he had earned 10 taels of silver with a wave of his hand? He took out the silver ingot and slammed it on the table. He ignored the shocked gazes of the man surnamed Fong and the others and continued to drink his tea. 10 taels of silver was undoubtedly an astronomical figure to the people present. If they were frugal, their families wouldn't have to worry about food and clothing for the next few years. They worked hard to herd the horses for a month, but their wages were only about 100 copper coins. The silver ingot in front of them was more than 100 times their wages. Even Lu Rui's pretty face finally lit up. She looked at Li Yi again. After a long time, the man surnamed Fong swallowed a mouthful of saliva and raised his head to look at Li Yi as he asked, Young master, this silver, could it be that you stole it?" Other than this reason, he couldn't believe that Li Yi had managed to earn so much money in such a short period of time. What a bumpkin. Li Yi cast a disdainful glance at the burly man with the surname Fong. He waved the painting tube in his hand and said faintly, "This is the meticulous brushwork fee for painting for people in the city just now." Painting? The man surnamed Fong was stunned. 10 taels of silver for a painting? How was this painting? This was clearly robbery. They thought about how they had worked so hard for a few copper coins, but this person had earned 10 taels of silver in such a short period of time. Everyone felt sad, but when they raised their heads to look at Li Yi, their expressions changed drastically. As expected of a scholar, young master was still the best. Not to mention 10 taels of silver, even if they were given 1 or 2 taels of silver, their lives in the stockade village would not be so difficult. It was even possible that they could eat meat every few days. Although these people were only boorish men, Li Yi still felt a little proud to be looked at by so many boorish men with such admiring gazes. When people were proud, they would always feel a little inflated. Looking at everyone's admiring gazes, Li Yi felt extremely comfortable. He waved his hand and said in an extremely forthright manner, "Today's tea is on me." The total cost of tea for the few of them was only 5 copper coins. Li Yi took back the silver and happily paid the bill with his private stash. Suddenly he felt something. When he turned his head, he realized that Lu Rui was looking at him strangely. Chapter 34. For any family in Willow Leaf Village, 10 taels of silver was a huge sum of money. Even for Lu Rui, it was the first time she had seen so much money in her life. But at this moment when she looked at Li Yi, she was thinking about more than this. A few days ago, on Chinese Valentine's Day, the poem, Celestial on the Magpie Bridge, was widely spread in Willow Leaf Village. Even illiterate girls in the village could recite it completely. Lu Rui did not know much about poetry. When she heard Li Yi's poem from Xiao Huan's mouth, she only found it to be catchy. It sounded rather interesting. Especially the last sentence, "If love lasts forever, why stay together day and night?" It seemed to make some sense. Of course, there were times when she would think about more things. If she didn't have a deep understanding of the relationship between a man and a woman, she definitely wouldn't be able to write such a poem. Had this scholar experienced something exciting in the past? Could it be that in his heart, there was also a woman whom he yearned for but couldn't meet? But on the surface, it didn't seem like it. Thinking of his lazy, greedy face and his stealing second-aunt's chicken, it was hard to imagine what a powerful poem such a person could write. However, she could only think about it in her heart, and it was not appropriate to ask him. As for deeper things, such as whether a poem was good or bad, or how good it was, she had no concept of these things in her heart. Poetry was something that scholars played with. She could grab any scholar off the street and he or she would probably be able to come up with something similar. But after seeing some things with her own eyes, she realized that things didn't seem to be like this. Just now, when she was buying some women's daily necessities on the street, she happened to overhear 2 women talking about a poem called Immortals of the Magpie Bridge. The content was exactly the same as the one she had heard before. Later on, when they talked about the author of the poem, both of them expressed their admiration for the gifted scholar named Li Yi. Until now, the talented scholar they were talking about gradually overlapped with the lazy figure in Lu Rui's mind. After that, she paid more attention and heard more information. For example, this poem came from a poetry meeting on the night of the Double Seventh Festival. It was said that someone picked up a prayer lantern on a pleasure boat. This poem, which caused an uproar among the literati of Anqing Prefecture, was written on this prayer lantern. Regardless of whether it was true or not, this rumor undoubtedly added a layer of mystery to the entire matter. However, this was a legendary story that most people only talked about after a meal. There were still a few people who did not doubt its authenticity. Lu Rui was one of them. She saw Xiao Huan's prayer lantern fly with her own eyes. At that time, no one in Willow Village would have thought that the ordinary poem written on the lantern would cause such a stir in a certain place. It was said that the champion of the Qixi Poetry Festival, a famous scholar from Jianghu Prefecture, had seen the poem, The Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. He tore his own poem into pieces and said, "I will never write another Qixi Poetry Festival again in this life." This shocked everyone and it added fuel to the fire of the whole matter. After the poetry meeting, a special person compiled the Double Seventh Festival Poetry Anthology. This poem, Flying Poem from Beyond the Heavens, was ranked first. Just like that, a scholar named Li Yi was known by the literati of Jianghu Prefecture, singers, actors, and many women who admired this poem. Those who were chosen to compile the poetry anthology were naturally not ordinary people. At the very least, they were talented enough to convince everyone. Since ancient times, there has been no first place in literature. In the past, there would always be a debate about the order of the poems chosen. But this time, no one had a different opinion about this Celestial on the Magpie Bridge being ranked first. At the same time, the gifted scholar called Li Yi had captured the hearts of countless young ladies with his words. If the feelings between the two were to last for a long time, why would they stay together day and night? Of course, it wasn't just those young ladies. Some of the women who had truly experienced the twists and turns of their relationships were probably even more affected by these words. Even though his origin was still a mystery, it did not affect the admiration of the women. Even Li Yi himself did not know about this. Of course, Lu Rui knew about this. Thinking of the intoxicated expressions on the two women's faces as they talked, Lu Rui could not imagine how they would react if they knew that the peerless scholar they admired was this guy in front of her. Of course, she would never have imagined that the poem he had casually composed would be so good. Of all the scholars in Qing and Fu, not a single one could compare. Lu Rui did not know much about scholars. Even now, she still could not accept that the person she had casually snatched was so good. At this moment, she pushed these thoughts aside and lowered her head to see the paper tube that Li Yi had placed on the table. She reached out to take it. Beside her, Li Yi raised his head and saw that Lu Rui was preparing to open the painting. His heart suddenly jumped and he hurriedly ran over, reaching out to snatch it. If she saw that he had drawn her, who knew what she would think? Naturally, Li Yi's speed could not catch up to Lu Rui. She lightly raised her hand and Li Yi pounced on empty air. What is this? Seeing how anxious he was, Lu Rui raised her eyebrows and asked. Nothing, it's just a doodle? Li Yi laughed dryly. He could not tell the truth at this time. If she thought that he had feelings for her brother-in-law falling in love with his sister-in-law, it sounded quite exciting. Lu Rui looked at him meaningfully. She did not open the painting in her hands and casually threw the painting tube back. Li Yi hurriedly caught it and his heart finally relaxed. How should we spend this money? Not wanting to be entangled in this problem, Li Yi hurriedly changed the topic. Of course, to buy grain. Everyone, including the large man surnamed Fong, spoke almost in unison. To them, even if they had 100 liang of silver, it was far from being able to carry a full jar of rice at home. Living at the bottom of society, nothing could replace the importance of grain and land in their hearts. Their family was already so poor that they could not even feed themselves. They definitely had to buy grain. Even if they did not say it, Li Yi had this plan. With a wave of his hand, the group of people entered the city in a grandiose manner. At the same time, the young girl carrying the painting walked one round on the street. After buying some things, she walked into a rather lavishly decorated small building in a busy area of the street. Chapter 35. Entering through the door, what came into view was an extremely spacious hall. Many coquettishly dressed women swayed their waists as they shuttled through the hall. Occasionally, they would conveniently lie into the arms of a guest, and the man's hands would immediately become unruly. The girl carrying the painting carefully avoided the crowd and went up the stairs on the side to the second floor. After a few steps, the door beside her suddenly opened, and a man with a ruddy face walked out. The girl once again skillfully avoided him, and walked straight to the door of the innermost room. If two lovers love each other for a long time, why would they be together day and night? A mellow voice came from the room. The woman in the room had finished singing one of the most famous lyrics recently, and shook her head. I've practiced for a long time, but my singing is still not good enough. I've ruined this good poem. A gentle woman opposite her looked at her with a smile and said, Drunken Mo, it's your standards that are too high. Even the sisters in the workshop who are good at singing can't compare to your singing just now. But even so, it still can't compare to Sister Ruoqing. The woman sighed and said in a somewhat helpless tone. The gentle woman only smiled when she heard this and did not speak. At this moment, the door was gently pushed open, and a young servant girl came in from outside with the painting. Miss, the painting is back. The young servant girl walked to the two of them, and first handed the painting in her hand to the woman who had just sung, and then bowed to the gentle woman. She said softly, Greetings, Miss Wan. Long time no see. Xiao Chui has become more and more beautiful, the gentle woman said with a smile. The young servant girl blushed slightly, and at this moment, the woman had already opened the painting. After looking over, she let out a sound of surprise. Who is she? The woman looked at the unfamiliar woman in the painting, and asked with a puzzled expression. The person in the painting was also an extremely beautiful woman. She had an exquisite figure and wore a white tight robe. Her arms were crossed in front of her chest, and she was full of heroic spirit. At a glance, the woman in the painting seemed to be walking out of the paper, and it was extremely lifelike. This painting. In the next moment, the woman had already forgotten that the person in the painting wasn't her. She was completely amazed by the painting. As the leading artist of the Jade's courtyard, she was very proficient in reading, writing, poetry, and painting. She was especially proficient in painting. This painting was exquisite, but there was nothing outstanding about it. However, she had never seen such a new form. There was no need for exquisite brushwork to be able to depict the characters so vividly. Not only were they lifelike, but the feeling of them leaping out of the paper was enough to amaze anyone who saw them. Ah! At this moment, the servant girl also saw the woman in the painting and couldn't help but cry out in alarm. Then she said with a bitter expression, "Miss, I seem to have taken the wrong painting. I'll immediately exchange it." At this moment she was feeling a little regretful. If she had known this would happen, she would have listened to the scholar's words and opened it to take a look. She wouldn't have made such a mistake. Wait a moment. When the woman heard this, she shook her head and thought for a moment. Then she said, "Leave this painting here. When you go to get the painting, tell the painter that we've bought this painting and ask him to paint another one." When the servant girl heard this, she nodded and walked out of the room. After leaving the room, she remembered that the scholar had already closed the stall early today. If she wanted to get the painting, she would probably have to wait until tomorrow. Xiao Chui, you really are an idiot." After cursing a few times in her heart, the servant girl pouted and went downstairs dejectedly. In the room, the woman's gaze was still on the painting. Her beautiful eyes flashed with surprise from time to time. She was filled with curiosity about this painting technique that she had never seen before. When the gentle woman beside her saw her like this, she also looked over curiously. When she saw who the woman in the painting was, she couldn't help but let out a soft cry of surprise. "This painting is so strange. It's clearly on the paper, but the woman in the painting looks like she's about to walk out." The woman nodded and said, "This must be a new technique. I don't know who thought of it, but this person's attainments in painting likely far surpass mine." At this point, a look of reverence appeared on her face. She thought that she had to get to know this painting master. At the same time, her gaze moved down. When she saw where the name should have been, her expression suddenly changed and a hint of anger appeared on her face. She scolded, "Which family's naughty child is this? How dare he randomly scribble on this painting? Lily, don't let me see you." After finally recognizing the name, the anger on the woman's pretty face became even more intense. In her heart, the naughty child, named Li had probably been spanked until his butt bloomed. At this moment, the woman did not notice that after hearing the name, Li, the gentle woman beside her was stunned for a moment. Then, she hurriedly looked at the lower left corner of the painting. When she saw the crooked handwriting that looked like the handwriting of a child who had just learned to write, a deep joy suddenly appeared on her beautiful face. After confirming the familiar handwriting, she suddenly grabbed the hand of the woman beside her and said anxiously, "Zuimo, who made this painting? Quick, take me to see him." "Sister, watching, what's wrong?" The woman named Zuimo had never seen the gentle woman show such an expression. After being stunned for a moment, she asked with a face full of surprise. The burly man surnamed Fong and the others each carried 2 stone of grain on their shoulders as they strode out of a grain shop in Qingyan Prefecture. The shop assistant at the door stared with wide eyes as he watched these burly men easily carry 2 bags of rice on their shoulders and stride like the wind. He could not help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. It was not that there were no people who bought so much grain at once. It was not that he was surprised by this. It was just that the strength of these burly men had truly frightened him. 10 stone of rice cost a full 5 taels of silver. In such a short time, half of Li Yi's wealth had already been spent. Although it was a little painful, Li Yi would not hesitate at all to spend the money that should be spent. The horses that had been led down the mountain in the morning still needed to be used for the next 2 days. The group could only walk back. Green Willow Mountain was not far from Anqing Prefecture. It was only about an hour's journey on foot. All the heavy objects were carried by the burly man surnamed Fong and the others. Li Yi felt relaxed. However, it had been a long time since he had walked such a long distance. When he walked back, his legs were still a little sore. The few of them carried 2 coarse cloth bags on their shoulders and swaggered through the stockade. Naturally, it was very easy to attract the attention of others. Of course, compared to these, the big man surnamed Fong was carrying a piece of pork on his shoulder that attracted more attention. Most of the people in the stockade could not even guarantee 2 meals a day. It was unknown how long it had been since many people had touched meat. Suddenly seeing this scene, the impact in their hearts was quite big. Watching them walk away, someone suddenly lowered his head and picked up something from the ground. The crowd took a closer look and found that it was actually a grain of rice. Seeming to have thought of something, everyone's expression changed involuntarily. Could it be that all the things in the bags just now were all rice? There was so much grain. Did they go down the mountain to rob it? Such an absurd thought appeared in everyone's mind. Chapter 36. For most of the families in the stockade village, there was never more than 1 bucket of rice in the rice jar at home. Their daily meals were mainly rice bran mixed with wild vegetables. The Liu family's life was slightly more prosperous, but it was at the level where they could only drink porridge. If the burly man surnamed Fong and the others were carrying rice on their shoulders, this idea was too extravagant, and they didn't even dare to think about it. It should be known that all the families in the entire Willow Leaf village combined might not even be able to gather 1 stone of rice, but those people had at least 10 stone, right? Under everyone's suspicious and shocked gazes, the burly man surnamed Fong and the others walked through the stockade village with their heads held high. When they looked at the direct descendants of the Liu family who usually didn't get along with them, their faces were full of undisguised pride and arrogance. In this day and age, being able to fill one's stomach gave one the right to be arrogant. Those who ate porridge could look down on those who ate bran vegetables, and those who ate rice could naturally look down on those who ate porridge. Carrying rice and meat in the stockade village, one's back could be straighter than others. Xiao Huan was in the courtyard washing the clothes that Li Yi had changed out of yesterday. The courtyard door was suddenly pushed open, and the burly man surnamed Fong and the others walked in with a glowing face, carrying bags on their shoulders. Uncle Fong. Seeing Li Yi and Lu Rui behind the burly man surnamed Fong and the others, the young servant girl hurriedly stood up from the stool. Young master, where should we put the food? Walking into the courtyard, the burly man surnamed Fong shouted at the top of his voice. Li Yi pointed in the direction of the kitchen and said, "Move it all there. Leave half of the meat and 2 stone of the food. Everyone can take the rest and divide it." The burly man surnamed Fong was stunned at first, as if he couldn't believe his ears. Then he hurriedly said, "Young master, you can't Li Yi waved his hand and didn't wait for the burly man surnamed Fong to continue. "I have the final say on how to divide these things. It's decided." Then, he stretched out his hand and waved it in front of the little maid, who didn't know what was happening. "Don't wash the clothes. Go and boil some hot water first. We need it for bathing later." After running around for a whole day, riding the horse all the way back and walking all the way back, Li Yi did not have the stamina of the burly man surnamed Fong. He was unbearably tired and there were probably a few blisters under his feet. Now he just wanted to take a comfortable hot bath and then have a good sleep. No matter how big the matter was, he would deal with it tomorrow. The young servant girl's gaze rested on the half a fan of pork carried by the burly man surnamed Fong for a long time. When she heard Li Yi call her, she hurriedly responded with an N, put down the clothes in her hands and ran to boil water. "Son-in-law, wait, you really can't do this." The man surnamed Fong put down the things on his shoulder and was about to chase after Li Yi when a figure suddenly blocked his path. "Just do as brother-in-law said just now. Everyone take these things and distribute them. Don't forget to give Elder Qin and Aunt Sun a share." Lu Rui watched Li Yi's back disappear into the house, and a strange look flashed in her beautiful eyes. Then she turned to speak to the burly man surnamed Fong and the others. "Second miss, the burly man surnamed Fong and the others looked at her with complicated gazes, but they didn't say anything for a long time. In today's times, a few buckets of food could feed a family. The food that was distributed was enough for them to not have to worry about food for a few months. "Alright, I know that everyone's days are not easy. We're all family, so there's no need to be so polite." A rare smile appeared on Lu Rui's usually cold face. After a long time, the burly man surnamed Fong turned around and saw that the few people behind him were still looking in the direction that Lu Rui disappeared with grateful eyes. He smiled honestly and punched the shoulder of the person beside him. He pointed to the kitchen and said, "What are you waiting for? Move the things in first." Wearing only a loincloth and lying in the wooden bathtub that was half the height of a person, Li Yi immediately felt refreshed. The fatigue accumulated during the day was swept away. The only flaw was that the space in the bathtub was a little small. If there was a chance in the future, he would definitely make a bathtub or dig a big bathtub at home and use it as a hot spring and a swimming pool. Xiao Huan walked in from outside and added some warm water into the bathtub. When she looked at the bathtub, her pretty face couldn't help but blush slightly. She thought about the situation when she first met the son-in-law, and her little face became even more like a ripe apple. "Son-in-law, Xiao Huan will help you wipe your back." The little servant girl picked up the towel and said softly. The little servant girl was very skilled at scrubbing his back. Her strength was neither light nor heavy. Li Yi leaned on the edge of the bathtub and enjoyed the little servant girl's back-scrubbing service. He suddenly felt that the life of the ancient people was too extravagant and too depraved. It was already like this to have a little servant girl. He didn't know how luxurious those rich people's homes were. As a good youth of the 21st century, how could he allow himself to degenerate and be poisoned by the luxurious atmosphere of the feudal society? A man shouldn't be greedy for pleasure. Thinking like this, he opened his mouth and said to Xiao Huan, "A little to the left, a little to the left." "Yes, there." After a long day of hard work, The happiest thing was to have a comfortable hot bath under the service of a beautiful servant girl and then have a good night's sleep. It was a dreamless night of sleep until the next morning. Of course, if a beautiful servant girl could serve him in bed, it would be even better. He didn't think about having a servant girl serve him in bed. A 15 or 16-year-old girl was still underage in the future. Li wasn't that beastly. Towards this adorably silly servant girl, Li had never thought in that direction. Moreover, if he really did this, he was worried that when he woke up tomorrow morning, his wife or sister-in-law would cut off his tool of crime. A moment later, the little servant girl left the room. When she passed by the kitchen, she went in to take a look. Seeing half a piece of pork on the table and 2 stones of white rice on the side, her small mouth slightly opened. It was hard to say whether the expression on her face was surprise or joy. In the past, when she went out to buy things, she would at most buy a small bag of brown rice or flour. There wasn't any extra money at home to buy more things. This was the first time the little servant girl had seen so much food. It seems that the son-in-law bought all of this. After muttering a few words, a trace of a smile appeared on the young girl's face. She faintly felt proud. Putting away the piece of pork, she walked briskly back to the courtyard to wash the clothes that she hadn't finished washing. Halfway through the bath, she remembered that the son-in-law had instructed her to lock something in a cabinet and not let the second young miss see it. The young maidservant hurriedly got up and picked up a painting tube that was placed on the table by the door. Just as she was about to lock it in the cabinet, her footsteps suddenly paused. She peeked into the bedroom and found that Li was already asleep. When she looked at the thing in her hands again, a trace of doubt appeared on her small face. What is it that is so mysterious? Not letting second Miss see, Xiao Huan secretly opened it to take a look. Son-in-law shouldn't know, right? Once again confirming that Li wouldn't suddenly wake up, the young girl pulled open the string on the outside of the painting tube like a thief. When the portrait of an extremely beautiful and unfamiliar girl appeared in front of her, the little servant girl's expression froze. For a moment she was stunned. After a long time, she stuck out her tongue and said in a small voice, "If 2 people love each other for a long time, why would they stay together day and night?" The person son-in-law was talking about, could it be this girl? Chapter 37. The maidservant named Xiao Huan would sometimes think about what kind of life the son-in-law led before he came up the mountain. Who was in his family, whether he was married, whether he had a girl in his heart. Later, as they lived together for a long time, she gradually understood some things. Some of the information that Li unintentionally revealed made the maidservant dispel some of her assumptions, but she was not so sure about most things. As early as the night of Chinese Valentine's Day, when Li became very strange, the maidservant already had some guesses in her heart. If 2 people love each other for a long time, why would they stay together day and night? She had pestered Sister Qin, the only one in the village who had read books, to explain the meaning of these 2 sentences to her. She only remembered that Sister Qin had said at that time that son-in-law was probably a person with a story. She looked at the painting in her hand again. Looking at the beautiful girl, the maidservant could not help but let her imagination run wild. Could it be that this was son-in-law's former sweetheart? One was a dignified scholar, the other was a charming beauty. They should have been a pair that would be envied by the world, helping each other in times of hardship and accompanying each other for a lifetime. But suddenly there was a great change. The scholar was kidnapped by the mountain bandits and became the husband of the village's stronghold, while the beauty sat alone in her boudoir, washing her face with tears. Although it could not be seen normally, son-in-law's heart must have been very bitter, right? Thinking of this, an inexplicable feeling suddenly surged in the young girl's heart. She felt a lump in her throat and her heart tightened. Tears fell down her cheeks. "Xiao Huan, what's wrong?" A familiar voice suddenly sounded beside her. The young girl was startled. When she turned her head, she saw Lu Rui standing behind her. "Ah, second miss?" She quickly reached out to wipe her tears and said, "Nothing, I accidentally squinted my eyes just now." "What is this?" Lu Rui looked at the seemingly familiar painting in her hand and looked over. A nap solved 1,000 worries. When Li woke up the next day, it was almost lunchtime. Of course, he didn't have time to teach the naughty children, and no one paid him a salary. He didn't have enough motivation to work. Fortunately, it was up to him whether he went to school or not, and there were no restrictions. There was no one in the courtyard. Lu Rui should have gone out to practice. As for Lu Rui, Li hadn't seen her since yesterday. He was used to her occasional disappearances. Xiao Huan was cooking in the kitchen. It was not appropriate for a man to wander around the kitchen all the time. Moreover, after a long time, Li himself would get tired of it. As early as half a month ago, he had begun to consciously teach Xiao Huan some things about cooking. In short, she could not just casually throw something into the pot and cook it like before. Eating should be a kind of enjoyment, not as simple as filling the stomach. After washing up, he walked to the door and stretched his body. Breathing in the fresh air from the mountains, he immediately felt refreshed. The air wasn't polluted by industrialization. Every breath he took was filled with the smell of nature. It was extremely fresh and had a strong smell of meat. After carefully distinguishing it, Li Yi was sure that he didn't smell wrong. It was indeed the smell of meat. The smell didn't come from his own kitchen. Last night, he had told Xiao Huan to handle the meat himself. He wrinkled his nose and sniffed. Looking in the direction of the smell, he saw the naughty child from Master Fang's family walking over with a huge bowl in his hands. The naughty child walked up to Li Yi holding the bowl and said timidly, "Young master, my father asked me to bring this over." Seeing the big bowl of cooked meat in the naughty child's hands, Li Yi smiled and patted his head. He took the bowl from his hands. Although he didn't lack it, it was a kind gesture, so he couldn't refuse it. After completing the task his father gave him, the naughty child didn't even say, "Goodbye, young master," and ran home. Today not only was there delicious rice but there was also meat to eat. The naughty child's smile had already reached the corner of his mouth, and his heart had already flown home. Not only did Li Yi smell the strong smell of meat, but many people in the Willow Leaf village stood at the door and swallowed their saliva as they smelled the fragrance in the air. Looking at the situation in the village, even rice was a luxury. It had been a long time since the people in the village smelled the smell of meat. When they saw the naughty children strolling around the village with bowls of white rice and a layer of meat on top of the rice, everyone couldn't stay calm. Not to mention pork, even the richest family in the village couldn't be so extravagant with white rice. A group of landless tenant farmers actually ate better food than the people of the Lu family who had land. Many people couldn't help but stare at them. Thinking of what happened yesterday, some people finally realized that the things that Master Fang and his people brought back to the village were really food. A whole 10 stones of rice. For them, this was no less than an astronomical figure. Some people couldn't help but run to inquire about the news. When they came back, they were in a trance. They were worried that they didn't have a place to show off. When they were asked, Master Fang and his people naturally didn't hide anything and told them the whole story. When the news reached the ears of the people, it became a story of a powerful new son-in-law who easily exchanged a painting for 10 taels of silver. The meat and food were all bought by him. After hearing this piece of news, the crowd was left with nothing but deep shock. Among them, no one had seen what 10 taels of silver looked like. Previously, Fang's family was so poor that they didn't even have food to eat, but now they could eat rice and meat, which shocked them even more. At this time, the ones who regretted the most were the women who paid Li Yi to paint on the Chinese Valentine's Day. When they thought that the sky lamp they released was worth 10 taels of silver, their hearts were bleeding. Using 10 taels of silver to release the sky lamp was probably the most extravagant thing they had ever done in their lives. As for those who were originally from families similar to Master Fang and his people, they could only watch the people eat meat. They were filled with regret. They secretly regretted why they didn't stand on the side of Lu Rui and Lu Rui when everyone joined forces to attack the direct line of descent. Of course, there were also people who secretly thought that they should go down the mountain and kidnap a scholar. They wouldn't let him do anything and just lock him in his room to paint every day, but it was just a thought. If any scholar had this kind of ability to earn money, how could there be a poor scholar? No matter how jealous the direct line of descent and the others were, they had to admit, Lu Rui had really picked up a treasure this time. Chapter 38. Li Yi did not know that he had become a treasure in some people's hearts. At this moment he was taking inventory of the things he bought when he went down the mountain. Other than grain, meat and some common vegetable seeds, he also bought a lot of seasonings that were used in cooking. He originally thought that the ancient people would be far inferior to the modern people in this aspect. But what Li Yi did not expect was that the seasonings of this era were actually more than what he had seen in the modern world. He was dazzled by the variety and simply bought a little of everything. After buying a lot of things, he spent more than half of the 10 taels of silver. There was still about 3 taels of silver left, but Li Yi did not spend it immediately. He kept some money for emergencies. When it was time to eat breakfast, Rui had not returned yet. When Li Yi asked Xiao Huan about it, the reply he received was that the young miss was often like this and the servant girl was already used to it. As for Lu Rui, Li Yi did not have much to worry about. To be able to shatter a solid wooden table with one palm, she was indeed a hero among heroes. Under normal circumstances she would not encounter any danger. It was just that disappearing without a sound was not a good habit. Li shook his head and no longer thought about this matter. He took out the hawthorns he bought yesterday and walked into the kitchen. Xiao Huan was washing the dishes in the kitchen. When she saw Li walk in, she poured the leftover frosting from the Qiao Qiao festival into the pot. After adding a little water, she used a small fire to slowly boil it. After instructing the servant girl to watch the fire and not burn the syrup, Li cleaned the hawthorns and used a knife to carefully cut them in half. He took out the seeds and polished the bamboo skewers that he had prepared beforehand and placed them to one side. The servant girl sat in front of the stove, her large eyes occasionally glancing in his direction. Son-in-law looks like he is going to make something delicious again, the servant girl thought and began to look forward to the delicious food she was about to eat. What Li planned to make today was candied hawthorns. There were no candied hawthorns in this world, but in his original world, it was one of the most popular snacks for thousands of years. Although there were great changes in the types of candied hawthorns in modern times, whether it was the careful selection of the raw materials, the exquisite packaging or the substitution of other fruits, the taste of candied hawthorns was constantly changing. However, there was a kind of sourness with a hint of sweetness and a lingering fragrance in the mouth that could never be replaced. When Li was young in his hometown in the countryside, what he most looked forward to seeing was the peddler who carried a swollen wooden stick filled with candied hawthorns. He would spend a few cents to buy a stick of candied hawthorns and would lick it for half a day. Later, when he grew up, he did not eat it again. Now that he came to this world, he missed that familiar taste. When these memories that belonged to him appeared in this world, his heart would also receive some comfort. Not long after, when the sugar in the pot was almost cooked, Li skewered the hawthorns on the bamboo skewers and rolled them in the pot. The surface of the fruit was covered with a layer of crystal-clear sugar coating. After taking it out of the pot, the sugar quickly condensed and the world's first stick of candied hawthorns was out of the pot. In less than a quarter of an hour, Li and Xiao Huan were squatting at the door, each holding 2 skewers of candied haws in their hands. They took a bite and after a crisp sound, there was a sweet and sour taste in their mouths. This was the first time the servant girl ate candied hawthorns. She did not eat them in one bite like Li, but first stuck out her little tongue to lick the sugar coating. Even her heart was filled with sweetness and her eyes curved into beautiful crescent moons. This scene was obviously very tempting. After a glance, Li did not dare to look anymore. A young girl's unintentional action could almost make people lose control. What would happen when she grew up? Facing the 3 beauties at home all day, she could still maintain her chastity. Li felt that even if Lu Xiaohui was reborn, he would not be able to do this. What is this? After finishing the 2 sticks of candied hawthorns in a few bites, a voice suddenly came from behind. Turning his head, he saw Lu Rui walking over with a stick of candied hawthorns in her hand. There was only half of the hawthorns left on the top. It was obvious that she had taken a bite. Oh, that is used to poison rats. There is arsenic in the icing, you must not eat it. Flicking away the remaining sugar residue at the corner of Lu Rui's mouth, Li said with a straight face. As soon as he finished speaking, Lu Rui's expression changed and her pretty face immediately turned pale. Young master, one of the candied hawthorns is missing. At this moment, the young servant girl walked over with 2 sticks of candied hawthorns in her hand and said with some confusion. Lu Rui turned her head and saw the thing in Xiao Huan's hand. There was still a bit of sugar coating at the corner of her mouth. When she turned back to look at Li, her pretty face turned cold and her hand was already on the hilt of the sword at her waist. Li raised his eyebrows. He was so used to teasing Xiao Huan that he did not realize that it was the witch Lu Rui just now. He stood up abruptly and strode out of the door. I remember now, we still have to go to school today. The young servant girl was stunned when she heard that. She said, Young master, have you forgotten? The school is closed today, you don't have to go. Ahem ahem. Little Huan, you remembered wrongly. Li coughed dryly as he quickened his pace. His casual joke had clearly frightened Lu Rui. If she were to fly into a rage out of humiliation, he would not be able to withstand it with his puny body. Bang! Li, who was rushing away from the scene, was caught off guard and bumped into someone. It was soft and he smelled a familiar fragrance. Lu Rui raised her head and looked at him. She frowned and said, Husband, why are you in such a hurry? Li looked up and was about to speak when he suddenly saw blood seeping out of her sleeve where he bumped into her just now. He could not help but be stunned. It was just a bump. Was it so serious? Then he realized something and hurriedly grabbed her hand and asked, Are you hurt? Miss, what happened to you? The young servant girl ran out of the courtyard and asked in panic. Lu Rui's figure followed closely behind. Seeing that she was standing there and was not seriously injured, she felt slightly relieved and asked, "Are you okay?" Lu Rui withdrew her hand without a trace and smiled faintly. She said, "It's just a small injury. It's not a big deal." She reached out and handed a small bag of things to Xiao Huan. She said, "There's some food here. Put it in the kitchen. You've lost so much blood. What's not a big deal?" Li Yi frowned and threw the small bag of food to the side. He grabbed Lu Rui's hand again and strode into the house. "Xiao Huan, go boil some water and bring the small box in my room over." Soon a voice came from the house. The young servant girl nodded and ran to the kitchen to boil water. Being dragged into the house by Li Yi, Lu Rui opened her mouth but did not say anything in the end. Inside the house, Li Yi held Lu Rui's arm and untied the bandage she had casually wrapped around her wound. When he saw the wound that was more than 2 inches long and was still bleeding, he could not help but gasp. "How did you get hurt?" A cold light flashed in Lu Rui's beautiful eyes when she saw the wound. Chapter 39. At this moment, the most important thing was not how Lu Rui got injured but how to treat the wound. In ancient times there were no antibiotics. If the wound got infected and the condition worsened, there was no way to treat it. One could only lie down and wait for death. Without any awareness of disinfection, the number of people who died from infected wounds every year was uncountable. She did not know where this cloth was found. Although it looked clean, it was definitely full of bacteria. The wound had never been disinfected. This was a matter of life and death. Was there a need to be so careless? "Son-in-law, the water is ready." Not long after, a maidservant ran in with a clean copper basin. The conditions were too harsh and there was no condition to use alcohol or iodophor to disinfect. He mixed some salt water according to the ratio and asked the maid to throw a clean towel into the pot to boil. After dipping it in the salt water, he carefully cleaned Lu Rui's wound. The effect of salt water was not as good as alcohol, but it was better than nothing. Fortunately, the wound was not deep. Otherwise, the wound would have to be sutured before the medicine could be applied. There was no medical bandage, so he could only use gauze that had been boiled in boiling water as a substitute. The last time when Xiao Huan cut her hand, Li Yi prepared some and it came in handy this time. From the beginning to the end, Lu Rui just watched quietly and did not say a word. As a martial artist, there were countless bumps and bruises in daily life. However, their physique was far better than ordinary people. Even if it was a knife wound, it could heal quickly. She did not take such a small injury to heart. But at this moment, Li Yi's serious look made her not say the words of rejection that she wanted to say. This was the first time in her life that she had seen such a method of treating wounds. Although she didn't know why he had to use salt water to clean the wound, and the gauze used to bandage the wound seemed to be particular, Lu Rui was very convinced of Li Yi's abilities. Moreover, this feeling of being taken care of was something that she had not experienced for a long time. Of course, if he did not tie a butterfly knot with the gauze at the end, everything would be even more perfect. As for Lu Rui taking apart the butterfly knot that she tied with great difficulty and making an ugly knot, Li Yi had some complaints in his heart. What a beautiful bow. It was pleasing to the eye and looked a little cute. Xiao Huan was still the most obedient. After treating Lu Rui's wound, she went out to teach the little maid how to tie a butterfly knot. "Sis, in the future, don't help the government catch those fugitives." After Li Yi and Xiao Huan left, Rui sat in front of the bed, holding Lu Rui's hand and said after a long silence. Lu Rui smiled and said, "I was careless this time and underestimated his strength. It won't happen again. Sister, you don't have to do these things anymore." Lu Rui seemed to have thought of something as a smile appeared on her pretty face. She said, "Our family will no longer lack food in the future." Lu Rui didn't understand what she meant. He looked up at her in confusion. "Do you still remember the immortal magpie bridge?" Lu Rui's face showed a rare hint of teasing as she said, "Sister, you have a good husband." As the young girl spoke in a low voice, Lu Rui's pretty face finally showed a surprised expression. "The Qishi poetry champion, 10 taels of silver for a painting?" In the room, the two of them whispered to each other like sisters. Li Yi tied a ribbon into a butterfly knot and tied it on the little maid's hair. The young girl lowered her head and fiddled with the corner of her clothes, her pretty face blushing. Reality proved that Li Yi's worries were completely unnecessary. The speed at which Lu Rui's wound healed far exceeded his expectations. This made him extremely suspicious in his heart. Could it be that her body structure was different from others? Such a long gash could heal without leaving a scar in half a month. Was she still a human? Of course, his relationship with Lu Rui hadn't reached the point where they could study each other's body structure. This kind of strange relationship between husband and wife was probably the only one in the stockade village. Sitting on a rock under the tree in front of the door, a group of naughty children whizzed past him. When they ran past him, they bowed and greeted him, "Mister," and then whizzed away. Teaching the naughty children was still a part of Li Yi's daily life. The naughty children now didn't just know how to write their own names. When he was bored, he taught them how to write Arabic numerals. After a few days, the naughty children's level was still at the level of addition and subtraction within 10. In the beginning, the naughty children were very slow to accept this new type of marking. However, ever since Li Yi took out a stick of candied hawthorn as a reward for the naughty child who memorized it the fastest, all the naughty children couldn't sit still anymore. The power of candied hawthorn began to show for the first time in this strange world. In just one morning, all the naughty children in the school had memorized how to write the Arabic numerals 1 to 10. It was completely different from the later generations, where they had to make up a mnemonic song like, 1 is thin and long like a pencil, 2 is like a duckling floating on water. For the naughty children, delicious food was the number one productive force. Therefore, in the afternoon, all the naughty children in the school ate candied hawthorn. Of course, Li Yi's position in the hearts of the naughty children had risen to a new height. The naughty children didn't care about the grudges between their elders. They would remember whoever told them stories and gave them candies. Even the naughtiest naughty child in the stockade village would behave in front of Li Yi. This was something that all the naughty children's parents were envious of. Moreover, in the recent days, the image of Li Yi in the hearts of the direct descendants of the Lu clan had undergone an earth-shattering change. They could look down on the scholar who didn't even have the strength to truss a chicken, but if this scholar could casually draw a painting in exchange for 10 stone meters of rice, then everything would be different. Looking at the fact that someone who used to live at the same standard of living as them or even worse than them, could eat rice for every meal, this kind of psychological gap was not something that could be erased in a short period of time. Moreover, it could be foreseen that this was only the beginning. It wouldn't be long before there would be an even greater gap in the stockade village. Those who wanted to seize the land and other resources that belonged to Lu Rui and her sister did so to improve their own lives. However, who would have thought that because of this reason, they would become enemies with the direct descendants of the Lu clan, which would instead cause them a greater loss. In a short period of time, more and more people began to weigh the gains and losses in their hearts. And a certain scholar who caused this change was currently waving a palm leaf fan, leisurely sitting under a tree in front of the door to enjoy the cool air. Although the weather at the beginning of August had already entered autumn, the weather at night was still hot and stuffy. Staying inside the house was even more irritating, so it was better to enjoy the wind under the tree outside. The only bad thing was that there were a lot of mosquitoes here. In just a short while, Li Yi's body had already been bitten several times. Just as he was wondering if there was any way to repel the mosquitoes, a sturdy figure walked over from the front. Chapter 40. It had been a long time since Li Yi came to Willow Leaf Village. At first, there was a little unpleasantness between him and the man surnamed Fong. Li Yi suffered a lot when he was caught and thrown on the back of a horse. However, as the two gradually became familiar with each other, the little unpleasantness also disappeared. Old Fong's temperament was very simple and honest. Although he was a little stupid, he was loyal to Lu Rui and her sister. Li Yi liked such a simple and honest person. There were a dozen simple people like the man surnamed Fong in the village. If it were not for these people who had been helping them all these years, Lu Rui and her sister would have been eaten up by those covetous uncles. Whoever was good to his wife and sister-in-law, he would be good to them. This had always been Li Yi's way of doing things. That was why he could distribute the food to them without so much as a frown. During this period of time, he had truly treated them as his own people. The man surnamed Fong came over and sat on the stone next to Li Yi. You seem to be in a bad mood. Fong, what's wrong? You look sad. Did Dahe steal Zhu Zi's steamed buns again? After getting familiar with him, Li Yi also called the man surnamed Fong casually. Zhu Zi was the son of the man surnamed Fong, and Dahe was their yellow native dog, a dog that always liked to steal the children's steamed buns. Li Yi had seen countless times that Dahe had a steamed bun in its mouth, and the man surnamed Fong chased it all over the village with a broom in his hand. He swore that he would kill it and eat it with wine when he got back. As a result, the chase between a man and a dog would happen again every few days. It was reasonable to say that the man surnamed Fong should not be worried recently. Because of the food distributed last time, Fong's family temporarily moved from the bottom of the village to a well-off level and walked ahead of most people. At least for a short time they did not have to worry about food and clothing. This was also what Li Yi found strange. At this time, the burly man surnamed Fang obviously shouldn't be worrying. Could it be that he also encountered those special days of the month? Of course, it could not be ruled out that the couple's life was not harmonious last night, and he was despised by his mother-in-law in the morning. However, looking at Fang's energetic appearance, this possibility should not be high. Sigh. The man with the surname Fang sighed and turned to look at Li Yi. He asked, "Young master, do you think I can only stay with my mother-in-law for the rest of my life?" When he said this, a strong unwillingness appeared on the face of the simple and honest man. At this moment, Li Yi actually saw in his eyes an unyielding resistance to fate. He looked at Fang with some surprise. If he didn't misunderstand, was Fang talking about his life ideals with him? For a long time, Li Yi had thought that Fang was just a salted fish without a dream. Like most people in the village, he had a home that could shelter him from the wind and rain, a wife and a child. He lived an ordinary life for a few decades and his life passed just like that. Once a salted fish had a dream, he would no longer be a salted fish. He would become a salted fish with a dream. From Fang's eyes, Li Yi could see his dissatisfaction with his current life. Obviously, Fang was different from the other guys who only had bodies but no brains. Could it be that you want to marry a few more concubines? Li Yi looked at Fang and asked in surprise. Fang shivered when he heard this. He looked around and didn't find his mother-in-law's shadow. Only then did he feel relieved. He sighed and said, "Zhuzi is not young anymore. In a few years I will arrange a marriage for him. But with the situation at home, we can't even afford a decent betrothal gift. We can't earn much money from herding horses, and it's not even enough to buy food. I'm thinking if I can find another way to make a living." "Young master, you are a capable person. Can you give me some ideas?" Li Yi didn't expect that Fang was actually worried about this matter. Fang's child should be less than 10 years old this year, right? He was running around the village naked all day with snot coming out of his nose. How could Fang think about marrying a wife so quickly? Even though he knew that people in this era generally got married much earlier than in modern times, he really couldn't imagine what that silly naughty child would look like when he got married. However, no matter what era it was, there was one thing that didn't change much. The problem that Fang was facing now should be the same as the man's parents worrying about buying a house and a car before they got married thousands of years later. Li Yi thought that Fang was tired of his mother-in-law all day long and wanted to find another concubine. He didn't expect that Fang was actually planning for his naughty child. Poor parents in the world. There was a heaven-defying cheating device in his mind. In this incomparably backward feudal era, Li Yi actually had countless ways to earn money. Simple alcohol purification, making a few pieces of soap, a few bottles of perfume, or even selling paintings could make a fortune. The reason why he hadn't taken action yet was because he was too lazy. After experiencing life and death, the current Li Yi felt that his previous life was really boring. Every day he did things that he didn't want to do. Every day he worked hard and conscientiously. It was too boring and too tiring. As a person who had lived 2 lives, he had to sit there every day and paint for people. What was the difference between him and his previous life? Life wasn't just about being born and living on. He didn't want to be rich and powerful, but he wanted to live a peaceful life. This was his current attitude towards life. Of course, before that, he had to accumulate enough wealth. Otherwise, he could only pursue a peaceful life while eating scraps and vegetables. It was a good thing that Fang had ideas and ideals. Recently, Li Yi also had an idea in his mind. After being here for so long, it was time to do something for this world. High-density alcohol and soap could not be made in a hurry. Just buying the raw materials would cost a lot. Without dozens or hundreds of taels of silver, he could only think about it. The cost was small and the returns were quick. Li Yi thought about it for a while and finally came up with a good idea. The candied haws that only appeared in the Willow Leaf village should go out of the mountain and bring benefits to the naughty children in this world. The hawthorn fruit needed to make candied haws was called red fruit in this world. For people living in the mountain, it was a material with zero cost. There was a large hawthorn forest behind the mountain, and there were as many fresh hawthorn fruits as one wanted. The icing used to make the candied haws needed to be bought in the marketplace at the foot of the mountain, but the price was not too high. 2 taels of silver were enough to start the candied haws plan. For the time being, it would be the first step of his plan to make money in this world. Li Yi had absolute confidence in this kind of treasure, which had been passed down for thousands of years in the original world and was still very attractive to naughty children. The reason why he hadn't brought it up was that he didn't want to work himself to death all day carrying a stick through the streets. When he turned around and saw old Fang's depressed face, Li Yi's face lit up like a spring breeze. Speaking of this idea, I do have one. Chapter 41. When Fang stood up and went home, his face was still a little confused. With his wood-like brain, he still couldn't figure out what was so good about those unripe and sour red fruits that he didn't like to eat. Why did the son-in-law want him to pick those things? As for the reason why he wanted him to chop the bamboo, old Fang couldn't figure it out. But soon, the confusion and bewilderment on his face disappeared. Thinking about the white rice and pork at home, all of old Fang's doubts were thrown out the window. The son-in-law was very capable. If he followed the son-in-law, he would have meat to eat. His words couldn't be wrong. In the following days, Fang's life began to become busy. Not only Fang, but also the naughty children of the Fang family were ruthlessly deprived of their time to play. They could no longer follow the naughty children in the stockade every day. They followed their father, went to the back mountain in the morning and came back in the afternoon, often carrying a few bamboo sticks on their shoulders. Occasionally, people would see Fang go down the mountain before dawn every day and return to the stockade at night with a big bag of things on his back. He didn't even let go of the horse. No one knew what he was doing mysteriously. There was no impenetrable wall in the world. In the Willow Leaf village, no one had any secrets to speak of. Soon, everyone knew that the thing Fang Laosan was playing with was called candied haws. It was a kind of hawthorn fruit that could be put together and sold outside. Hawthorn was not valuable to the people of the Willow Leaf village. There was a large hawthorn forest in the back mountain, which was the public property of the stockade. However, even if the fruits were ripe every year, no one would pick them. They were sour, and the more they ate, the hungrier they got. If they ate too much, their teeth would fall out. Only those greedy naughty children would pick a few every year when the fruits were ripe to satisfy their cravings. It wasn't that no one had considered selling the hawthorn at the foot of the mountain, but firstly, hawthorn was too common and cheap. Secondly, hawthorn ripened during the busy farming season. If they abandoned their work in the fields and walked these crooked paths instead, they would be ridiculed by everyone in the village. Fang was the object of everyone's ridicule. What was so good about hawthorn fruits? Only the ignorant children in the stockade village were interested in them. There was nothing good to eat or play in Qing, and prefectural city. It would be strange if anyone would spend money to buy these hawthorn fruits. Herding horses was a good job. Every month he could earn 100 copper coins. It was enough for him to buy a few caddies of rice. Why didn't he have to resort to such dishonest means? However, they soon realized that Fang Laosan's family did not lack those few caddies of rice. But this did not affect the mockery they felt towards Fang. When everyone didn't have any lofty ideals or ambitions and just wanted to be a salted fish for the rest of their lives, Fang, a salted fish with dreams, would easily attract the attention of others. We're all salted fish. It's good enough for us to face the yellow soil and face the sky for the rest of our lives. What right do you have to dream? As a result, Fang, the salted fish that wanted to be reborn, quickly became the topic of conversation among the people in the village. Did you guys hear? Fang Laosan seems to be selling some candied haws. Dishonest means. Doesn't he know if he's cut out for it? Sigh, of course Fang Laosan wouldn't have thought of this idea. I heard that it was Rui's husband who came up with it. Hee, what does that scholar know? I heard that he invested a lot of money this time. I'll wait and see how he ends up. Arguments like this were not uncommon in the middle level of Willow Leaf village. Even Li Yi had heard of it. However, he just listened to these gossips and laughed it off. There were many people in the village who wanted to see him make a fool of himself. Sometimes he would sigh in his heart. Lu Rui and her sister seemed to have enemies everywhere in the village. Xiao Huan, on the other hand, was very indignant about some of the words she accidentally heard. Li Yi had seen her pouting and nagging when she came back from outside several times. What do you know? The candied haws made by the son-in-law are very delicious. You will definitely make a lot of money. Then you guys will die of anger. The little maid had been with Lu's sister Rui since she was a child. Naturally, she had been treated coldly by other people of the Lu family. In order not to cause trouble for Miss Rui, she had been wronged outside and could only endure it when she came back. This situation changed a lot after Li Yi came. Now, they didn't have to worry about their livelihood all day long. They could walk with their heads held high outside. The son-in-law was a really powerful person. No one in the village could compare with him. What right did they have to laugh at the son-in-law? What Li Yi didn't expect was that those rumors had no effect on him, but Fang couldn't help it. Son-in-law, will there really be people willing to buy this candied haws? Until now, Fang still had doubts about the feasibility of this matter. After all, it was just an ordinary hawthorn. Even if it was covered with sugar, it was still a hawthorn. The son-in-law had given him all the money. If all the money went to waste in the end, even if the son-in-law didn't blame him, he would feel bad. Seeing that Fang was looking at him with a perturbed expression, Li glanced at him and said, "If you don't feel at ease, why don't I find someone else to do it?" Old Wu came to find me this morning and said that he wants to try too. Why don't you rest and let him do it? Looking at the expression on Li Yi's face, Fang felt at ease. The next moment, Fang's face immediately changed into his signature honest smile. He put his arm around Li Yi's shoulder and said, there's no need. Old Wu has a one-track mind. He's not the type to do this. Besides, what kind of relationship do I have with the son-in-law? Don't forget that I was the one who captured the son-in-law. Seeing the burly man with the surname Fang walk out with a smile, several black lines appeared on Li Yi's face. It was very easy to make candied hawthorns and didn't require much preparation time. Fang had already bought the icing from the foot of the mountain. The August hawthorns were not fully ripe yet, but it didn't affect the taste much. Under Li Yi's guidance, Fang cut all the bamboo from the mountain into bamboo sticks of similar size. The edges were polished smooth and the bottom of the bamboo stick was slightly wider, making it more suitable to hold. After the hawthorns were seeded and coated in the syrup, he dipped a little sesame seed on the top. There was a little white in the middle, making it look even more attractive. He stuck all of the candied hawthorns on wooden sticks and brooms. Seeing the naughty child beside him gulping down his saliva, Fang felt a little more confident. He took down a candied hawthorn and handed it to him. He conveniently kicked the naughty child's butt and said, "Listen to your mother at home. Wait for me to come back tonight." 2 hours later, on the crowded main street of Qing'an Prefecture, the simple and honest man carried a strange object and stood by the side of the road. He hesitated for a long time before a resolute expression appeared on his face. A moment later, a voice full of energy traveled over. "Ice candied gourd." For a moment, several gazes were cast over from the crowd on the street. Chapter 42. Candied haws. What is that? I don't know, I've never heard of it before. Let's go and take a look. The term candied haws was undoubtedly a new term to the people of this world. With a curious mentality, the pedestrians on the street all looked in the direction of the voice. They saw a burly man standing in a corner of the street, holding a long object in his hand. The top of the object was densely packed with something. Looking closely, those things that were the size of abacus beads were strung together. Weren't they just ordinary red fruits? Even if the red fruit was covered with a layer of crystal clear stuff and sprinkled with sesame seeds, it couldn't change the fact that it was a red fruit. "Hey man, how much are you selling this ice something gourd?" A young man in a long robe came forward and asked. 5 copper coins for a skewer." The simple and honest man immediately replied. 5 copper coins? The young man was stunned at first, then he shook his head and left. Red fruits were not rare. One could buy a few caddies of them on the street for 1 copper coin. Only a fool would spend 5 copper coins for just a few of them. I thought it was some rare item, but it's just a few red fruits. 5 copper coins for a skewer. This man really dares to ask for a price. "Hey, there's nothing to see, let's go." When he saw the crowd that had been attracted by his first call quickly disappear, the heart of the man surnamed Fang could not help but sink. The thing that he was most worried about had happened. "Here's 5 copper coins, give me a skewer." A voice came from the side. The man surnamed Fang turned his head and saw a middle-aged scholar in navy blue robes. He took out 5 copper coins from his chest pocket and placed them in his hand. This was his first customer. The burly man was overjoyed and hurriedly put the money away. He took a skewer of candied haws and handed it over. "Your candied haws." The scholar reached out and took it, then left. The burly man, who wanted to get his evaluation, felt a little disappointed. After all, he didn't want everything he had done for the past few days to be in vain. In a place where the burly man surnamed Fang couldn't see, the middle-aged scholar took a bite of the sugar-coated haws, and a trace of surprise flashed across his face. He lowered his head to look at the sugar-coated haws in his hand and murmured, "There's sweetness in the sour, crispy and delicious. I really didn't expect that red fruits could be made in such a novel way." Because he was a little hungry, he bought a snack that he had never seen before on a whim, but it gave him a different kind of surprise. A smile appeared on the middle-aged scholar's face, and his mood seemed to improve a little. He continued to walk forward. At this moment, the burly man surnamed Fang, who had just completed his first transaction, had a glimmer of hope in his heart. He raised his head and shouted at the top of his lungs. Candied haws. Delicious candied haws. Candied haws, it's free if it's not sweet. After an hour, the man with the surname Fong, whose voice had become somewhat hoarse from all the shouting, leaned against the wall in an extremely discouraged manner. The trace of hope in his heart had also been mercilessly destroyed. Up until now, his second skewer of candied haws had not been sold. It had to be said that the shape of the candied haws was very peculiar, and it attracted many people to inquire about it. However, when they saw that the so-called candied haws were just a few red fruits strung together, and the price was actually 5 copper coins, they all lost interest. Should I try selling it for 1 copper coin a skewer first? Fong muttered to himself somewhat helplessly. However, when he remembered that the son-in-law had warned him before he left that a skewer of candied haws could not be less than 5 copper coins, he could only give up on this idea. On the street, a little further away from the burly man surnamed Fong, a mischievous child of about 5 or 6 years old was hugging a woman's thigh and wailing incessantly. Be good, mother will make delicious food for you when we get back. The woman helplessly said as she looked at her child who was suddenly making a scene. No matter how hard she tried to coax him, she could not calm him down. No, I want to eat it now. The mischievous child was obviously not that easy to fool. He hugged her thigh and shook his head vigorously. The mischievous child, who had long since figured out his mother's routine, knew that what awaited him when he returned home was definitely not delicious food, but a vicious beating as punishment for his disobedience. Rather than foolishly waiting to be beaten when he returned home, he might as well pester his mother for some benefits. This way it would be worth it even if he was beaten when he returned home. The mischievous child who was making a scene on the street quickly attracted the attention of passers-by. The woman also felt a little embarrassed when she was stared at by so many people. She wanted to calm the child down first, and then slowly educate him when they returned home. However, she suddenly realized that the crying beside her had stopped. She looked down and discovered that the mischievous child was staring straight ahead. He swallowed his saliva, pointed in the direction of the corner of the street and said, "Mother, I want that." After a moment, the mischievous child, who had tasted his desire, left while licking the candied haws in satisfaction. He was extremely fond of this delicacy that he had never tasted before. After finishing all of the hawthorns, he licked the sugar off the bamboo stick, but he was reluctant to throw it away. He carefully put it away and even licked the residue from the corner of his mouth. He was filled with joy, thinking that he would definitely tell a few of his close friends when he returned home. He did not notice that the woman beside him had a rather unpleasant expression on her face. The first thing he would be greeted with when he returned home was a vicious beating. After 2 whole hours, he had only sold 2 candied haws. Fong's heart was already in complete despair. This time, I'm afraid the young master is going to be disappointed. After letting out a long sigh, the man with the surname Fong picked up the stick with the candied haws and prepared to return home. He had only taken a few steps when he suddenly heard a flurry of footsteps behind him. In the next moment, he discovered that he had been surrounded. The people surrounding Fong were a group of mischievous children. The oldest among them was only 10 years old, and they all looked at Fong with excited gazes, the candied haws in his hands. The mischievous child standing at the very front was about 5 or 6 years old. Fong had just met him. He was the one who had taken care of his second business. The mischievous child covered his butt with one hand, and the tears on his face had yet to dry. He pointed at the skewers of candied haws and said, "This is the one. Whether I lied to you or not, you'll know soon enough." After saying that, the mischievous child stretched out his small hand and revealed the 5 copper coins in his palm. He said loudly, "Uncle, I want a skewer of candied haws." "Me too." "Me too. I want 2 skewers." The mischievous children chattered one after another. Fong looked at the fair and clean little hands that were stretched out, and his expression was a little dazed. On the street, a girl passing by was puzzled as she watched a group of excited naughty kids rushing past her. Each of them was holding a skewer of food and eating deliciously. When she looked ahead, she saw a burly man carrying a strange stick. The strength of the mischievous children could not be underestimated. A small portion of the candied haws disappeared in an instant, and was replaced by a large pile of copper coins in his pocket. "Excuse me, how much is this?" Just as Fong was standing there in a daze, a pleasant voice came from the side. Seeing the incomparably delicate young girl standing next to him, the man with the surname Fong couldn't help but blush. He said, Five copper coins? All right, give me one." The young girl nodded and said with a smile. She took a small bite, and her mouth was instantly filled with a sweet and sour taste. The young girl's beautiful eyes slightly brightened. She took out a small piece of silver from her beautiful pouch and pointed at the remaining candied haws. I want all of these. Chapter 43. Fong had brought around 30 skewers of candied haws with him today. Half of them had been bought by the naughty children, and there were still around a dozen left. It was obvious that the young girl couldn't carry them all by herself. After the young girl paid, Fong took the initiative to help her deliver them to the place. With so many copper coins in his pocket, it felt heavy and made him feel very at ease. At this moment, Fong couldn't help but feel ashamed for doubting his son-in-law's thoughts. Uncle, how are these candied haws made? The young girl walked in front with a skewer of candied haws in her hand. She gently licked the sugar coating and guessed that it was frosting, but she wasn't sure. She turned her head and asked in confusion. Miss, I can't tell you that. Fong laughed foolishly. He didn't reveal the method of making the candied haws just because the young girl was beautiful. Fong wasn't that stupid. This was something he would use to make his family rich in the future. How could he just casually tell others? Hearing Fong's answer, the young girl was stunned for a moment. After a while, she also realized that her question was a bit inappropriate. She smiled apologetically and said, Sorry, I forgot that this is Uncle's secret recipe. I shouldn't have asked. Fong laughed foolishly and didn't reply. He followed behind the young girl and walked through the noisy street. He didn't know when it started, but the crowd started to thin out. The buildings on both sides also gradually became more luxurious. There was a row of red doors with mighty stone lions in front of them. It was extremely extravagant. To buy a stronghold here, it would probably cost a lot of money. Fong muttered to himself. He also began to wonder about the identity of the young girl. After all, the people who could live here were either rich or noble. They weren't people ordinary people like them could come into contact with. It's here. Not long after, the young girl stopped walking. She turned around and smiled at the man surnamed Fong. Wait here for a moment. I'll go in and come out immediately. Fong nodded and watched the young girl walk through the 10-feet-tall door. The two servants at the door bent over and said something. Because he was too far away, he couldn't hear clearly. Not long after, the young girl's figure appeared again. 4 young girls followed behind her, each holding a tray in their hands. They walked to the front of the burly man surnamed Fong and looked at the strings of crystal-clear candied haws. The young girl on the left asked curiously, Sister Yenji, what is this? Don't ask too much. I'll tell you later. First, pluck these candied haws. The girls looked at Fong with puzzled eyes, then looked at the candied haws one by one. He couldn't throw away the stick he was carrying on his shoulder. By the time these girls took all the candied haws off the tree, Fong's mission had been completed. Before he left, he heard one of the girls muttering, Isn't this just a red fruit? What's so rare about it? As for what happened after that, Fong was not in the mood to listen. He just wanted to go back to the stockade village and start making the next batch of candied haws. At this time, in the backyard of an extremely luxurious mansion in Anqing Prefecture City. Who would have thought that a mere red fruit could be made so delicious? A young girl licked her lips as if she hadn't had enough. Her action was extremely seductive. You actually doubted me just now. The young girl named Yenji glanced at her and said, Hee, it's all my fault. Thank you, Sister Yenji. The young girl shook her arm in a fawning manner and said with a smile, It's strange. These are just ordinary red fruits. How can there be such a big difference in the taste? A young girl said doubtfully. It should be because of the layer of icing on the outside. This candied haws shouldn't be difficult to make. We can try it in the future. The young girl named Yenji thought for a moment and said, Although she didn't ask for the method of making it, it wasn't hard to guess. After all, other than the red fruit, there was only a layer of sweetness on the outside of the candied haws. It seemed like the icing had melted and then wrapped around it. Yenji, what are you doing here? A gentle voice suddenly came from behind them. The young girls turned their heads and saw a beautiful woman walking over with the support of 2 servant girls. The woman had a beautiful face. Although the crow's feet at the corner of her eyes betrayed her age, her charm didn't diminish. It was just that her face was a little haggard and thin. Her face was also abnormally pale. Princess, seeing this woman, the young girls stood up in a panic. They were also a little nervous. They were the servants of the prince's mansion. If they were to gather here, it would be easy to think that they were slacking off. Princess, why did you come out? The wind is strong outside. You should go back quickly. The young girl named Yenji had a worried expression on her face. She hurriedly walked over and supported the woman as she spoke. The beautiful woman shook her head and said, It's fine. It's so stuffy to stay in the room. It's good to come out for a walk. After speaking, her eyes inadvertently glanced behind the young girls. On the stone table, there was a string of red and crystal clear things. She walked over and asked curiously, "What is this?" The young girl closest to her quickly wiped the corner of her mouth and said respectfully, "Princess, this is called candied haws." "Candied haws?" The woman asked again, "What is this thing used for?" "Princess, this is a snack that Yenji bought on the street." The young girl named Yenji came forward and said. The woman nodded and picked up a stick of candied haws. After looking at it, she said, "It's crystal clear and looks good." She then took a bite. The sweet and sour taste made her mouth water. She then said, "It's delicious." Seeing the woman finish the stick of candied haws, all the young girls couldn't help but widen their eyes. Especially the young girl named Yenji, a look of surprise appeared on her pretty face. As the personal maid of the princess, she certainly knew that the princess had been feeling unwell these days. She could hardly eat anything. Occasionally she would eat something, but she would quickly spit it out. As a result, she had lost a lot of weight. Many doctors had been invited, but they were all useless. Even the specially invited imperial doctors were helpless. After so many days, this was the first time she had seen the princess eat so happily. "Why do I feel even hungrier after eating all this?" After eating the candied haws in her hand, the woman had a look of confusion on her face. She said, "Yenji, tell the kitchen to make some food and send it to the room later." "Yes, princess, I'll go right away." The young girl's face was even more surprised. After responding, she immediately trotted away. A moment later, in the study of the manor, the middle-aged man who was reading in the room suddenly stood up when he heard the servant's report. With a face full of joy, he said, "What did you say? Princess can eat now?" The young girl nodded and said, "Yes, the princess took the initiative to ask the kitchen to make food. Sister Yenji said that the princess ate a lot tonight. Quick, take me to see the princess." The middle-aged man laughed and strode out of the room after his beloved wife's stubborn illness was cured. At the same time, Fong also strode into Li Yi's house. Clatter. Piling up a large pile of copper coins on the table in front of him, Fong laughed and said, "Young master, all the candied haws have been sold." Previously he only earned 100 copper coins a month. Today, in just a short time, it was equivalent to his monthly income. Fong was extremely happy. "Now we don't have to worry about whether Zhuzi can get a wife or not, do we?" This result was within Li Yi's expectation, so he said with a smile. Lao Fong laughed heartily and said with lofty sentiments, "Don't worry. If we make money in the future, we can also learn from those rich people and live in big houses, marry a few concubines and live a comfortable life." The big houses that he saw today had obviously completely stimulated Fong, and even his life goals had been raised a lot. It seemed that he was shocked by Fong's lofty ideals. Li Yi's smile froze on his face. After a while, he sighed, stood up, patted Fong on the shoulder, and turned away without saying a word. "Young master, what's wrong?" Li Yi's actions puzzled the man with the surname Fong. Just as he was about to ask, he seemed to have sensed something. He turned his head abruptly and saw a familiar face appear behind him. However, at this time this familiar face was extremely gloomy. Who else could it be but his wife? "Fool, what did you just say?" In just a moment, the broom in Li Yi's house was in Madame Fong's hand. What a sin! Li Yi stood in the courtyard and heard the screams coming from the room. He sighed deeply. Chapter 44. Li Yi really couldn't see it. Fong, who usually looked very gentle, could turn into a tough woman in a second. She waved the broom vigorously in her hand. Fong had a body full of skills, but at this moment he couldn't use any of them. He could only cover his head and flee like a rat. Li Yi, who was standing in the courtyard, happened to catch a glimpse of Madame Fong's ferocious scene inside the house, and he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. If you're not from the same family, you're from the same family. Old Fong's family probably all have Super Saiyan genes and can complete a gorgeous transformation in an instant. Half an hour later, Li Yi waved a palm leaf fan in his hand and leisurely sat under a tree at the entrance to enjoy the cool breeze. Opposite him, the bruised and swollen face of the burly man surnamed Fong looked at him with a bitter expression. "Son-in-law, you are not kind." Fong held back for a long time before saying this. Obviously, he was still brooding over the fact that Li Yi didn't remind him just now. "Don't look at me like that. I didn't say anything. You asked for it." Being stared at by this guy with big eyes, Li Yi always felt like he was being stared at by a dog. He hurriedly waved his hand and said, It was obviously Fong who had a cheap mouth. This kind of thing couldn't be blamed on him. Fong opened his mouth and found that he was speechless. He carefully thought about what Li Yi said and suddenly felt that what he said was very reasonable. It was him who said to live in a big house, and it was him who said to marry a concubine. Fortunately, he didn't say that he would divorce his mother-in-law at that time. Otherwise, how could he still stand here and talk to the son-in-law now? He could probably only nag a few words when he offered incense every year. Fong didn't want to talk about the sad past. Thinking about how popular the candied haws was, he was ecstatic and said, "You're right. This candied haws is really a good way to make money. It's much better than herding horses in the stockade." Li Yi looked at Fong with disdain. Up until now, Fong was still thinking about buying a big house and marrying a concubine. Perhaps even in his next life he would not be able to realize this dream. "Son-in-law, what should we do next?" Previously, Li Yi had said that today was just a small experiment. Fong couldn't wait to ask. Even good wine was afraid of a deep alley. If he wanted to sell candied haws in this world, it was obviously not enough for Fong to carry a stick and sell them on the street alone. Li Yi needed more manpower. "Go and ask everyone who else is willing to participate in this matter. We need more people." Li Yi thought about it and said. Li Yi originally wanted to let people who were close to Lu's sister Rui participate. For them, this was definitely beneficial and not harmful. It was enough to change their lives. Although they wouldn't become rich overnight, they wouldn't have to worry about food and clothing. However, he didn't want to force others. This matter still needed to be decided by them. "Do you still need to ask? Only a fool wouldn't do something to make money." Fong rolled his eyes, patted his chest and said, "Don't worry, son-in-law. Leave this matter to me." In his opinion, those who didn't want to make money were fools. It was difficult to even fill their stomachs while guarding the small piece of land at home, not to mention marrying a concubine and living in a big house. Good things should not flow to outsiders. Of course, Fong went to find his brothers who were familiar with him. In this era, it was undoubtedly very difficult for farmers who had been working in the fields all their lives to accept a new thing. In their eyes, only land and food were tangible and tangible things. However, since it was the son-in-law who asked, almost everyone agreed without any hesitation. After all, he was the man who gave their whole family a full meal. This kind of kindness was not to say that they would go through water and tread on fire, but when Li Yi needed them they would definitely stand up. Although there were still some doubts and apprehensions in their hearts, everyone chose to believe. When old Fong showed him what he had gained on the first day, his apprehension vanished like smoke in thin air. To be able to earn a net profit of 100 copper coins in a day for them, this kind of speed that was like robbing money was undoubtedly very attractive. That night everyone was busy. A few women washed the hawthorns overnight and boiled them into a sugar paste. Fong and the others skewered the hawthorns and coated them in the sugar paste. Finally, they sprinkled some stir-fried sesame seeds on top. The next day, when the sun had just risen, they hurried down the mountain. Naturally, the movement of so many people could not be hidden from others. The plump Lady Wu stood at the door of her house and watched as Master Fong and the others carried strange sticks out of the stockade. She curled her lips and said in a small voice, "A group of idiots. Sooner or later they will be killed by that poor scholar." In a very luxurious mansion in the Qing and prefectural city, the atmosphere today was different from usual. It was very jubilant. The servant girls and manservants who walked around the mansion all received double the usual amount of money. Everyone had smiles on their faces and even their steps were much lighter than usual. Do you have anything you want to eat today? I will immediately order the kitchen to make it." In a wide hall, a middle-aged man dressed in luxurious clothing smiled as he spoke to the beautiful woman beside him. The woman looked at the table full of delicious food in front of her and smiled helplessly. She said, "Your Highness, there is no need to trouble yourself. This is already enough. Has lost a lot of weight these days. I will send someone to deliver some tonics." The middle-aged man stroked the beautiful woman's pretty face and said with some heartache. The beautiful woman's face couldn't help but blush. She looked up at the young man opposite her and said in a small voice, "Xian'er is still here." The young man opposite them coughed dryly and said, "Father, mother, I didn't see anything." Hearing his words, the beautiful woman snorted and laughed. Then, as if remembering something, she said, "I don't really want to eat the other dishes, but I do miss the taste of the candied hawthorns from yesterday." The middle-aged man glared at the young man who was engrossed in eating. "What are you spacing out for? Didn't you hear what your mother said? Hurry up and buy the candied hawthorns." "Yes, father." It was quite awkward to sit here and watch his father and mother show off their affection. Hearing this, the young man immediately stood up and said, "I will go ask Yanji where she bought the candied hawthorns." "Wait." The middle-aged man thought for a moment and said, "Since your mother likes to eat it, why don't we directly invite that person to the mansion and arrange for him to be in the kitchen? That way she can eat it at any time." "I understand." The young man responded and then walked out of the hall. His mother's depression had improved and he was also very happy. From afar, he saw the girl called Yanji walking over and immediately waved at her. Chapter 45. Qing'an Prefecture was huge. If they wanted to spread the candied haws as quickly as possible, they would need a lot of manpower. Fang alone was far from enough. They parted ways at the city gate. Li Yi followed Fang and listened to him boast about how popular he was with the naughty kids yesterday. When they reached a certain street, Fang's body shook and he looked at the familiar corner of the street. A dozen naughty kids were gathered there, their faces full of anxiety. "What candied haws? Are you guys lying to us?" "Liars or puppies. There really were candied haws yesterday. Why didn't that uncle come today? Are there no candied haws today?" The naughty kids paced around anxiously. For the first time in their lives, they didn't sleep in this morning. They woke up all their friends early in the morning and asked their parents for a few copper coins before rushing here. However, they were disappointed to find that the uncle who sold candied haws yesterday was not here. The naughty kids even searched the surrounding area but couldn't find a single candied haw vendor. When they thought about how they would never be able to eat the sweet and sour candied haws again, the naughty kids became even more anxious. "Look, that uncle is here!" someone shouted first. The naughty kids turned their heads and saw a familiar figure standing on the street. The next moment, they saw the candied haws that they had been yearning for day and night. Whoosh! The scene from the day before replayed itself. "Uncle, I want 2 skewers. I want 3 skewers. Here are 20 copper coins. Give me 4 skewers." The naughty kids fought to be the first. One by one, they stretched out their little hands and stuffed the copper coins into Fang's arms. They were afraid that all the candied haws would be bought by someone else if they were too late. Seeing the naughty kids leave one by one in satisfaction, and the candied haws were half gone, Fang's face was full of smiles. This made him feel like he was one step closer to his dream. However, compared to the feeling of realizing his dream, another feeling came faster and more urgent. Not long after, Fang held his stomach, bent over and said to Li Yi, "Son-in-law, please look after him for a while. I'm going to relieve myself." Without waiting for Li Yi to nod, Fang had already disappeared. Li Yi originally wanted to wander around the city, but now he could only wait for Fang to return. After a while, a few sticks of tanghulu were sold. Almost all of the buyers were naughty children or some adults who were pestered by naughty children. Occasionally, a well-dressed young lady would buy a bunch or two, but when normal adults saw that these were just ordinary red fruits, they didn't have the heart to buy them. This was within Li Yi's expectations. The biggest consumer group of tanghulu were naughty children. Whether it was in ancient times or modern times, women and children were the absolute main consumers, which was in line with his initial positioning of tanghulu. The remaining dozen or so skewers of candied haws were sold out in a short while, leaving only 1 skewer stuck on top. It was an eyesore and uncomfortable no matter how he looked at it. Li Yi frowned and plucked the last skewer of candied haws. Just as he brought it to his mouth, a voice suddenly came from afar. "Shut up." Crunch. A crisp sound came. He had already bitten off the first stick of hawthorn fruit. In order to make delicious tanghulu, it was very important to control the heat when boiling the sugar paste. This time the sugar paste had been boiled for a long time, and it was a little burnt. He remembered to remind them to be careful next time. Then Li Yi raised his head and looked at the young man who was trotting over. After a moment of surprise, 2 voices came almost at the same time. "It's you? It's you." The young man was also a little surprised. He didn't expect that the person selling the tanghulu was actually the scholar who painted the last time. Of course, Li Yi also recognized this friend at once. After all, he had only met one rich man in this world who was willing to spend 10 taels of silver to buy a painting. After a short moment of surprise, the young man moved his eyes away from Li Yi's face and looked at the last stick of tanghulu in his hand, which he had already bitten off. "You." He stretched out a finger and pointed at Li Yi. Just as he said one word, he suddenly waved his hand dispiritedly, grabbed Li Yi's arm and said, "Follow me." "What are you doing?" The young man was thin and weak but he was quite strong. Li Yi staggered and was forcibly pulled forward by him. "Did you make this tanghulu? Let go of me first. Is it you or not?" So what if it is? That's right. Life was like being F***ed. Since he couldn't resist, he would enjoy it. After a while, Li Yi understood that his strength was far less than the young man's. If he continued to struggle like this, he would be the one suffering. So, he simply gave up resisting and followed the young man forward. It didn't look like this guy wanted to drag him to see the officials because someone died from eating tanghulu, as long as it wasn't about that. At this time, on the street not far in front of the two of them, several strong men swaggered. The leader was a man with a scar on his face. He took 2 steamed buns from a stall on the street. The stall owner saw that the man swaggered away without paying, and a trace of anger flashed in his eyes. Finally, he sighed and could only accept his bad luck. He dared to be angry but didn't dare to say anything. "Big brother, look who that is." Suddenly, one of the men beside the scarred man trembled and suddenly pointed to the front as if he had seen something. When the scarred man heard this, he looked up and saw a familiar figure. He was slightly startled, and his face immediately became gloomy. How could he forget that he was beaten up by a few hateful guys in the alley that day? He was beaten miserably. The saddest thing was that he was arrested and sent to jail for several days. Not only did he eat moldy food, he didn't even have a comfortable place to sleep. Every time he dreamed of those days, he would wake up in a cold sweat. The source of all this was because of the guy who made him gnash his teeth in hatred when he thought about it. And the scholar who he would only be satisfied with if he could destroy the people had now appeared in front of him again. Follow them. Even if these ruffians were bold, they still didn't dare to do anything too presumptuous on the street. With a gloomy face, they ordered and followed far behind the 2 people. Until now, Li Yi still didn't know where the young man was hurriedly dragging him and what they were going to do. Just as he was about to ask again, there was suddenly a burst of chaotic footsteps behind them. In an instant, the 2 of them were surrounded. "Who are you people? What do you want?" The young man asked with a frown when his path was blocked. "Brat, if you know what's good for you, hurry up and scram. This has nothing to do with you." The scarred man glared at the young man, and then looked at Li Yi with extreme hatred in his eyes. Chapter 46. When he saw the scar-faced man again, Li Yi knew that things were going to be bad. Just by looking at the hateful expression on his face and his fiery eyes, it was obvious that this guy was a very vengeful person. Last time he had Fong and the others by his side to protect him. This time it was just the 2 of them. Moreover, the young man beside him did not seem to have much combat power. It was likely that he would be defeated this time. The 2 of them had already passed through the most bustling street. At this time, there were only a few passers-by on both sides of the road. These people had clearly planned to surround them here. Scram. Although the young man did not recognize the scar-faced man in front of him, it was obvious that the other party was up to no good. His face darkened as he spoke coldly. It was obvious that the enemy was strong while he was weak, but this young man was still so unyielding. This caused Li Yi to involuntarily look at him a few more times. He was not afraid in the face of danger and did not bow down to evil forces. He had some of the demeanor that Li Yi had in the past. "What did you say?" The scar-faced man's expression froze. He looked at Li Yi and the young man in front of him with a gloomy expression. "Can't you see that I have so many people on my side? You actually dare to speak to me like this?" Thinking of the scholar's reaction last time, the scar-faced man looked at the 2 of them again. Could they be blood brothers? "Brat, I originally wanted to let you go today. Now, don't even think about leaving." The scar-faced man stared at the young man with an unfriendly gaze and said fiercely. Without those abnormal fellows from last time, the scar-faced man did not feel any pressure in his heart. "I'll give you 3 breaths of time to finish them off." At this time, the young man opened his mouth with a gloomy expression. It was as if he was speaking to the surrounding air. The scar-faced man and the other men were stunned when they heard this. It was obvious that they were surprised by the young man's actions. However, in the next moment, they could not help but burst into laughter. "Brat, could it be that you've lost your mind?" One of the men had just spoken halfway when a passerby who walked past him suddenly exploded and punched out. The man's body was immediately sent flying. There was no time for the scar-faced man and the others to react. A man who was squatting down at a roadside stall and picking up goods used one hand to support himself. With a sweep of his leg, another few men fell. Clang. It was the sound of a long sword being unsheathed. Suddenly, a flash of saber light flashed in front of the scar-faced man's eyes. A peddler who was carrying a load and walking by suddenly turned around, pulled out a long saber from his waist, and put it on the scar-faced man's neck. Everything happened so suddenly. Not only did the scar-faced man and the others not expect it, but even Li Yi was stunned. What the hell was going on? Let's go. At this moment, the young man grabbed Li Yi's arm again and walked straight past them as if nothing had happened. The scarred man stood there in a daze, cold sweat dripping down from his forehead. Steamed bun was once again held at knife point. At this moment he felt as if his entire outlook on life was collapsing. That person looked at him without any emotion, as if he was looking at a dead person. Just from the look in his eyes, the scar-faced man knew that he really dared to kill him. Until now, he still didn't understand why these passers-by were so skilled, and why they would listen to that young man. In the distance, there was suddenly a flurry of footsteps. A few bailiffs dressed in black jogged over. The moment he saw those bailiffs, the scar-faced man was so moved that tears almost flowed out. Although he didn't know how many times he had been taught a lesson by these bailiffs at this moment, seeing their figures, the scar-faced man felt as if he had seen his family. Family, come and save us. What are you doing? Put down your sabers. In Anqing Prefectural City, there were actually people who dared to use sabers to hurt people on the streets. The leading bailiffs roared, pulled out the saber at his waist and pointed it at the people in the distance. The expression of the man holding the saber didn't change. He felt around his waist and casually threw a token over. The bailiffs reached out and caught it. After glancing at it, his expression changed and he hurriedly put away his saber. He jogged over and said, "My lord, take all of these people back and await punishment." The man withdrew his saber from the scar-faced man's neck, waved his hand at the bailiffs, picked up his load and quickly disappeared into the streets. When the bailiffs looked back, he discovered that the two people who had been standing next to him had also disappeared. After standing in place for a moment, his expression darkened. He pointed at the ruffians and loudly said to the bailiffs, "Take them all back." With great difficulty, he found the restroom to relieve himself. Fang came out of the restroom with a satisfied expression. As he walked back along the street, he kept wondering if his wife had added something to his breakfast. Otherwise, how could he have gone to the restroom 4 times in a row, and now walk so lightly? Son-in-law. Walking to the familiar corner of the street, Fang had just opened his mouth to call out when he saw that the original position was empty. He suddenly froze and asked, "Son-in-law?" Just as the man surnamed Fang was looking for Li Yi all over the world, Li Yi was staring at a tall gate in a daze. The scene that had just happened on the street had already caused him to have some doubts about this young man's background. At this moment he deeply realized that this nouveau riche's background was not ordinary. Ningguang Mansion. Above the gate, there was a large plaque with these words written squarely on it. Of course, such a plaque could not be hung on the door of one's own house. Could it be that this young man in front of him was actually a member of the royal family of the Jing Kingdom? Before Li Yi could figure out this question, he was pulled into the gate by the young man. Young prince. The 2 servants standing at the door hurriedly bowed to greet him. This prince's mansion was very big. Being pulled by the young man, Li Yi didn't know how many twists and turns they had gone through, and finally stopped in front of a gatehouse. The young man pushed the door open, and when the few people in the room looked up, they immediately stopped what they were doing and bowed together, saying, "Young prince. Quick, make some candied fruits immediately." The young man waved his hand at them and said in a hurried tone. Hearing this, Li Yi was stunned for a moment. After all this time, this guy had hurriedly brought him here just to make candied fruits for him? This was the first time that Li Yi had seen such a willful nouveau riche. Looking around, looking at the furnishings here, it should be a kitchen or something like that. On the table beside him, there were some hawthorns and white sugar. It seemed that they had tried making candied fruits by themselves. However, although the method of making candied fruits was simple, the ratio of sugar to water, the temperature, and the time of boiling would affect the taste of the candied fruits. Without countless predecessors, hundreds and thousands of years of exploration and experimentation, it was really not an easy thing to make delicious candied fruits. Chapter 47. While Li Yi was looking around, the people around him were also looking at him. The person who made candied haws and improved the princess's depression was the scholar in front of them? It had to be said that this was quite different from the image they had imagined. It's not difficult to make candied haws. You just need to add water to the icing and boil it into a sugar paste, and then wrap it on the red fruits without seeds. Li Yi looked at the young man and said, "I've told you the method of making candied haws. I'm sorry, I still have something urgent to deal with. Goodbye." Li Yi didn't want to tell anyone about the core technique of candied haws. He was not familiar with this guy and he just wanted to keep his own territory. He didn't want to have anything to do with the prince's mansion. If he didn't go back, Fang would be worried if he couldn't find him. After that, Li strode outside. "Child, please wait." At this moment, a sweet voice came from behind. The girl named Yanji quickly walked up and said, "Child, you don't know. Although there are only two materials, red fruits and icing, we have tried many times, but the taste of the candied haws is still not satisfactory. Please tell me if there is any mystery in it." Li paused and then said with a smile, "Miss, I'm afraid you think too much. I've told you everything I know. There is no mystery in it." Li's face was full of sincerity. Although the girl still had doubts in her heart, she was already 70 to 80% convinced. She turned to the young man and said, "Young prince, the person who sold the candied haws yesterday was not this young master. I'm afraid we have the wrong person." Yes. Li nodded and quickened his pace toward the door. 10 taels of silver. At this moment, the young man suddenly said. The girl was stunned when she heard this. She didn't know what the little prince meant. At the same time, Li had just stepped out of the door when he suddenly stopped. "I was rude just now. If I offended you in any way, please don't blame me. Yanji, give this brother 10 taels of silver as an apology." Li turned his head and found that the young man was looking at him with a faint smile. After looking at the young man for a few seconds, Li also smiled. Only the two of them knew what this smile meant. This little prince was also a person who was particular. The smile on Li's face became even brighter. He said with a smile, "Although there is nothing special about the cooking method of this dish, it is rare for the young prince to be so kind. What's the harm in trying it out?" Although she didn't know why this child suddenly changed his mind, he had promised to help her. The girl was happy and said hurriedly, "Thank you very much." The strange expression on the young man's face became even more obvious. He stretched out his hand and made an inviting gesture. "Brother, please?" After a while, everyone, including the young man, looked at Li skillfully handling the hawthorn and boiling the sugar paste. His movements were smooth, and their faces revealed an astonished expression. For a gentle and refined scholar to do such things, it still gave them quite a shock. Because there were no bamboo sticks, Li wrapped the candied hawthorn in the sugar paste and placed it on a plate. The girl used her chopsticks to pick one up. After taking a bite, her beautiful eyes couldn't help but light up. She turned to the young man and said, "Little prince, this is the taste from yesterday. I'll send it to mother right away." The young man was overjoyed. He took the plate from the girl's hands and strode out. Li felt a little strange when he heard this. From the looks of it, the one who liked eating candied hawthorn seemed to be some princess. Could it be that eating candied hawthorn could make one addicted? After the young man left, the girl bowed to Li and said, "Thank you, young master. Thanks to young master's candied hawthorn, the princess's illness has improved." The princess's illness? Li was a little confused when he heard this. He really didn't know that candied hawthorn could actually have the effect of treating illnesses. "May I ask, what illness is the princess suffering from?" Li was a little curious and couldn't help but ask. The girl's expression was a little hesitant, but then she thought about it. If it wasn't for the scholar in front of her, the princess's illness wouldn't have improved. After thinking for a while, she said, "The imperial physician said it's an illness of stagnation. However, after taking the medicine for half a month, the princess is still tired of eating every day and can't sleep at night. During this period of time, her body has become increasingly thin." Li didn't know what an illness of stagnation was, but he understood from the girl's description. Can't eat, can't sleep, is prone to fever and is getting more and more haggard. Isn't this indigestion? Needless to say, Li also knew that in this prince's mansion, there must be a lot of fish and meat all day long. If one's stomach wasn't good, it would be strange if he didn't have indigestion. And candied hawthorn had the effect of clearing the lungs, digesting food and stimulating the appetite. It was especially effective for indigestion caused by eating too much meat. In his previous life, Li's stomach was very bad. Every time he came home, one of the dishes on the table was candied hawthorn. When he was studying abroad, his mother would often call to remind him to take care of his stomach, eat less greasy food, eat more coarse grains, pay attention to nourishing his stomach, and don't stay up late at night, and that person who loved him the most and treated him the best in the world, he would never see her again. Suddenly touching the deepest memories in his heart, Li's eyes unconsciously became wet. The girl named Yanji looked at the scholar with tears in his eyes in surprise. She just talked about the princess's illness, and this child was moved to tears? At this moment, the door of the kitchen was suddenly pushed open, and the young prince walked in with an excited face. He ordered a few cooks, immediately make some of the princess's favorite dishes. I didn't expect this candied hawthorn to have such a miraculous effect. The young man turned to look at Li Yi and said with a face full of surprise, the illness of stagnation that even the imperial physicians couldn't do anything about could actually improve because of this small thing. His mother, who was usually extremely anorexic, actually took the initiative to eat after eating those red fruits. It was really hard to imagine. At this moment, Li Yi's mood had already returned to normal. He smiled and said, the red fruits are indeed effective in treating stagnation, but it isn't a cure for the root cause. Do you know how to treat stagnation? The young man's body suddenly trembled when he heard this, and he grabbed Li Yi's arm and asked, I know a thing or two. Li Yi said with a smile. Li Yi felt a little apologetic in his heart for charging him 10 taels of silver for a candied hawthorn dish. No matter what, they were old customers. Li Yi had to make them feel that these 10 taels of silver were well spent. If these words were said by someone else, the young man and the girl would definitely not believe them. But when Li Yi said it, they already believed most of it. After all, he had already created a miracle. Just as the expressions on the two's faces became wild with joy, on the other side of Qing and Prefectural City, looking at the gradually darkening sky, Master Fang's face was full of anxiety and worry. Chapter 48. Fang searched the entire Qing and prefecture but did not find any trace of Li Yi. Fang Laosen, you fool. Isn't the son-in-law with you? You've lost him. Another man beside Fang looked equally anxious. I don't know. I just went to the bathroom and when I came back, the son-in-law was gone. Fang said helplessly. Even he couldn't understand. How could such a grown man like the son-in-law go missing just like that? If the son-in-law really can't be found, I'll see how you're going to explain it to Miss. The man beside him glared at him and said, Do you think the son-in-law ran away? At this moment, a hint of hesitation appeared on the other man's face and he spoke hesitantly. Nonsense. Hearing this, the man surnamed Fang was like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. He turned his head abruptly and looked at him with an unfriendly gaze. He reprimanded, The son-in-law is not that kind of person. Fang. The man who reprimanded the man surnamed Fang spoke in a low voice and said slowly, What old Wu said is not impossible. After all, the son-in-law, he did not finish his sentence but everyone understood what he meant. After all, the son-in-law was snatched. Although during this period of time, almost everyone had deliberately ignored this fact, it was still an undeniable fact. Because of the appearance of Li Yi, their lives had long been turned upside down. No one was willing to mention that matter. From the bottom of their hearts, they had already regarded Li Yi as one of their own. However, no matter how unwilling they were to admit it at this moment, everyone could not help but think of a certain worst possibility. Everyone, let's split up and search again. Where could the son-in-law be waiting for us? After a moment, a resolute expression appeared on the face of the man surnamed Fang. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice. The rest of them looked at each other and could only sigh. They dispersed and began another round of searching. Li Yi was not a medical student. If the princess had any other illness, he who had not digested a medical book, naturally had no right to speak. But when it came to treating gastrointestinal problems and indigestion, he could be considered half an expert. In his previous life, in order to adjust his stomach, his mother had used all kinds of methods. At that time, Li Yi did not care much about it. Now that he thought about it, each and every one of them was clearly imprinted in his mind, as if they were carved into his memory. Li Yi did not give them a long lecture on modern medical theories and directly said, Other than using red fruits and sugar to stir-fry candied haws, you can crush corn and yam together and boil it into porridge. It will also have a miraculous effect on treating Wang Fei's illness. Stir-fried hawthorn with sugar and yam porridge were common dishes on Li Yi's dining table. There was no digestive aid in this world. Hawthorn could only be used as an appetizer. When the appetite was good, the body would naturally be better. The pretty servant girl and the young prince listened attentively. Li Yi continued, Every day after dinner, Wang Fei can take a walk in the garden for an hour. It will also help to alleviate the illness. In addition, there is one more thing to remember. For this period of time, Wang Fei's diet should be light. You must not eat meat or fish all day. Try to avoid greasy food such as... At this point in Li Yi's speech, the young man hurriedly ordered the few cooks. Did you all hear that? Remove all the greasy dishes I mentioned. That's about all I know. After speaking for so long, Li Yi could not help but feel a little thirsty. His eyes inadvertently glanced out of the window and found that the sky had completely darkened. Yanji, do you remember everything I said? The young man turned to the young girl and asked. Hearing this, Yanji nodded. Young prince, I have remembered everything. Even the imperial physicians were helpless. This handsome scholar in front of them was their only hope. If Li Yi was giving them a prescription, they would definitely carefully consider it. But he did not mention anything from the beginning to the end. Most of it was a change in the diet. Although they did not understand the reason, it seemed that he did not speak without thinking. It is getting late. I have told you everything I know. I will not disturb you anymore. With the 10 taels of silver already in his pocket, Li Yi very timely said his goodbyes. If he was any later, Fang and the others would be anxious to death. The young man did not know whether Li Yi's method was effective or not. But the appearance of the candied hawthorn had indeed improved his mother's condition. For this he had to owe Li Yi a favor. Putting an arm around Li Yi's shoulder, he said, Brother, you have helped me so much. If I do not thank you properly, I will feel very sorry. How about this? We will hold a banquet in the Jade Courtyard tonight. We will not stop until we are drunk. During this period of time, his mother's illness had almost become a sore point in his heart. Now that he had seen endless hope, he was extremely carefree. There is no need for a banquet. I have urgent matters to attend to at home. Hey brother, this is not right. Are you looking down on me? I do not mean that. Then follow me. The young girl named Yanji watched the young prince and the scholar leave with their arms around each other's shoulders. Her pretty face could not help but show a trace of a smile. This young prince of her family was good at everything except for the fact that he did not have any arrogance. He looked like a playboy. If he were to inherit the throne in the future, the young girl really could not imagine what kind of situation it would be. This thought only appeared in her mind for a moment, and she hurriedly left the kitchen. Although she remembered everything that the scholar had said just now, it was hard to guarantee that she would not forget it in the future. It was better to find a piece of paper and write it down quickly. Li Yi was hurriedly dragged out of the prince's mansion by the young prince who did not look like a young prince at all. Outside the Willow Leaf village, the big man surnamed Fang walked into the village in a daze with a blank face. The few men behind him also looked worried. On the other side of the village, the young servant girl was busy in the kitchen. She was humming a little song that the son-in-law taught her. It was unknown what she was thinking, but the corners of her mouth slightly curled up and her 2 black eyebrows curved into a beautiful arc. It is almost the mid-autumn festival. When the son-in-law comes back, it is time to make some mooncakes. The young servant girl murmured. Suddenly there was a knock on the door in the courtyard. The son-in-law is back. The young girl's face lit up with joy. She ran out of the kitchen with light steps, crossed the courtyard and opened the door. When she saw the familiar face of Fang, the smile on her pretty face became even wider. Uncle Fang, you are back. After looking around, she found that other than the big man surnamed Fang and the others, there was no sign of Li Yi. A trace of doubt appeared on the young girl's pretty face and she asked, Where is the son-in-law? Fang raised his head and looked at Xiao Huan with a complicated expression. After a long time, he opened his mouth with some difficulty. The son-in-law is missing. What? The young girl's delicate body shook when she heard this. After she recovered, her pretty face immediately became pale. Chapter 49. Miss, it's all my fault. I should have stayed by the son-in-law's side. Master Fang lowered his head and spoke in a low voice. His face was filled with remorse. Lu Rui's expression did not change. After a moment of silence, she nodded and said, I understand. Unable to read the emotions in her heart, Master Fang and the others opened their mouths but did not say anything in the end. When they left with a sigh, Lu Rui leaned against the door with her sword in her arms. She looked at the almost full moon in the sky and her pretty face was as cold as ever. The young servant girl stood in the courtyard with red and swollen eyes and stared in the direction of the courtyard door. After a long time, she sniffed hard and murmured, The son-in-law will definitely come back. After an unknown period of time, Lu Rui walked into the room and looked at the woman in the room. She said, Sister, do you need me to go down the mountain? Lu Rui knew what she wanted to say and did not wait for her to finish. She waved her hand and said, There's no need. As she spoke, she looked a little absent-minded. Even though the two of them were not husband and wife, they were husband and wife after all. At this moment, she could not help but feel a little disappointed. Her initial plan was to let Li Yi go after a few days. But as time passed, her thoughts changed. No matter what, she would have to get married in this lifetime. In the past, she had always been busy for the sake of living and had never thought about these things. But these days, that slightly thin figure, in a relaxed manner, had inadvertently carried this family on her shoulders. She no longer had to worry about those things that she needed to worry about in the past. Occasionally, she would think that if he was unwilling to leave and they could continue like this for the rest of their lives, it would not be unacceptable even if the act between the two of them became real. But in the end, this was no longer possible. The Jadeite Courtyard. The name of this courtyard sounded indecent. Just from the name, one could tell that this was probably the same as Yihong Courtyard, and Kwai Hua Lu Li suspected that tonight was not just a simple meal. This young prince's way of doing things was completely different from what Li Yi had imagined. He always went out alone without a few lackeys. It was a great waste of resources. But thinking of the scene on the street in the afternoon, Li Yi immediately understood. On the surface he was alone. Who knew how many people were secretly protecting him? An ordinary passerby or an inconspicuous peddler on the street could turn into the ultimate bodyguard in an instant. Remember, after we go in, don't call me young prince. Just call me Brother Li. When they walked to the Jadeite courtyard, the young prince named Li Xian suddenly put his arm around Li Yi's shoulder and said in a low voice. Li Yi nodded. He was not surprised at all. People who wandered around in Jianghu used an alternate name to save their lives. When they visited a brothel, they still used the title of Little Prince. If this was spread out, their prince's father would probably break their legs. By the way, I still don't know this brother's name, Li Xian suddenly asked after taking 2 steps. Li Yi. Li Yi looked around curiously and whispered. After living for 2 lifetimes, this was the first time he had visited a brothel. He was a little excited. Brother, your surname is also Li. What a coincidence, Li Xian said in surprise. Although this guy was quite handsome, Li Yi still didn't want to have any fate with him. As soon as the two of them stepped into the jade courtyard, a woman in her 30s with heavy makeup immediately greeted them. She squeezed out a smile and said, Hey, isn't this Li? You haven't been here for a long time. Li Yi was stunned for a moment before he realized that the madam wasn't talking about him. Then he looked at Li Xian with a surprised expression. So this guy was actually a regular here. At this time, Li Yi couldn't help but have some doubts in his heart. Was this guy really a young lord? Don't say anything unnecessary. Where is Miss Zuemo? Hurry up and call her out. Li Xian waved his hand and threw her a silver ingot. He said impatiently. Li Yi turned to look at him. Didn't he say that he would treat her to a meal? How did it become a brothel to sleep with girls? His chastity of 2 lifetimes couldn't be casually given away here. If this guy made any unhealthy suggestions later, he must refuse without hesitation. The madam caught the silver and was slightly happy. But then she said with a troubled expression, Li, you know that Zuemo is our top artist here. It's up to her whether she sees guests or not. I can't force her. Li Xian frowned when he heard this. He hated people who didn't do anything after receiving the silver. Seeing this, the madam hurriedly changed the topic and said, However, Zuemo's program is about to start. Why don't I ask her after her program is over? Li Xian waved his hand and said, Forget it. I just want her to sing a song to liven things up. Since she is going on stage in a while, it will save me the trouble. The madam muttered in her heart. Every time this Li came to the jade courtyard, he didn't look for a girl. He just wanted to listen to Zuemo sing. It was really strange. However, she didn't dare to say this out loud. After all, this was her financial backer. A thick smile immediately appeared on her face and she called out, Gentlemen, please follow me to the private room. Drunken Emo will be here soon. The private room that the madam mentioned was a relatively spacious room. The floor was covered with a clean carpet, and there was a space in the middle separated by a curtain. After the madam led Li Yi and Zuemo to sit down, she excused herself and went to work. In front of the two of them was a long, short table. There were many fruits and all sorts of dishes on it. Li Xian sat cross-legged on the table. He casually picked up a grape from the table and popped it into his mouth. He glanced at Li Yi and said somewhat smugly, What? You've never been to a place like this before, right? Li Yi nodded when he heard this. It was indeed the first time he had been to such a place. Firstly, he had no money. He couldn't afford such a place at all. Secondly, he didn't have the opportunity. He couldn't imagine what would happen if Xiao Huan and Sister Rui knew that he visited a brothel. After all, he was a man with a family. Following Li Xian's example, Li Yi sat down cross-legged and looked around. There were quite a few silhouettes at the tables around the room. At that moment they were all quietly chatting with the people beside them. As Li Yi's gaze swept past the door, he suddenly saw a few silhouettes walk in. He could only see that those people were all women walking slowly into the gauze tent. Miss Zuemo is here. There was a small noise around. Not long after, when music came from the gauze tent, the slightly noisy crowd all shut their mouths. Li Yi also looked with interest at the few graceful figures who had begun to dance in the gauze tent. After a moment, a pleasant voice floated out from the gauze tent. Delicate clouds play tricks, flying stars spread hatred, the silver river crosses in the dark, the golden wind and jade do meet, surpassing countless things in the world. When he heard this, Li Yi's body shook violently, and an expression of extreme shock appeared on his face. Chapter 50. Li Yi was very sure that although poetry also existed in this world, it was only in the same form. Great writers such as Li Bai, Du Fu, Su Shi, and Lu Yong did not exist in the original world. Of course, their works would not appear in this world either. Translator, Lon_editor. Ephidacia. Li Yi was shocked when he heard the poem, which shouldn't have existed in this world. Then his shock turned into ecstasy. Could it be that the other party had also transmigrated to this world like him? No one could understand Li Yi's feelings. He was a lonely soul drifting alone in this world. Even if there was a person, no, even if it was a dog from the same world as him, it would still bring the greatest comfort to his soul. Li Xian, who was enjoying the song and dance, did not notice that Li Yi had become very excited. He abruptly stood up and strode to the center of the stage, pulling aside the veil. The woman who was singing with her face covered by a veil seemed to be frightened. Her voice came to an abrupt stop. She looked at the young scholar who had suddenly rushed over with an excited expression. A trace of panic appeared on her face under the veil. Did you also transmigrate from the earth? Li Yi grabbed the woman's hand and asked anxiously. At this moment, everyone in the surroundings had recovered from their shock. When everyone saw what was happening, they immediately stood up, and expressions of shock and anger appeared on their faces. Stop. Let go of Miss Zumo. Who dares to make trouble in this jade courtyard? The young prince, Li Xian, was also stunned, not knowing what was going on. This guy is so impatient. Let go of me, you lecher. When the woman's hand was grabbed by Li Yi, she was really frightened. She stood there in a daze and didn't move at all. However, when she came back to her senses, she suddenly shook off his hand. A look of shame and anger appeared on her face. She took a few steps back and looked at him as she scolded. Li Yi stood there in a daze. Things seemed to be different from what he had imagined. Looking at the girl's reaction, could it be that he had guessed wrong? Right at this moment, the madam ran in with a few strong men, and she cursed furiously, "Who the hell is so ignorant to actually dare to cause trouble in the Jadefield courtyard? Quickly arrest him." Those men saw Li Yi standing in the middle of the stage at a glance. They strode over and pressed down on his shoulders. Li Yi allowed the two men to pin his hands behind his back as he glared at the woman. "Where did you learn that Immortal Magpie Bridge song?" The woman didn't want to pay attention to him, but when she saw the crazed look in his eyes, her heart couldn't help but tremble. For some reason, she opened her mouth and explained, "This poem has been known to everyone since a month ago. It is said that it was written on the sky prayer lantern by a gifted scholar named Li Yi." A month ago, the sky prayer lantern Li Yi. Li Yi muttered a few words, and a look of deep disappointment appeared on his face. It should be Xiaohuan's sky prayer lamp. Hurry up and throw him out. The madam roared when she saw that the men were still standing in the same spot. Stop. Right at this moment, a voice rang out in front of them, and Li Xian slowly walked over with an ugly expression on his face. He walked to the front of the men and said coldly, "Let him go." "Who do you think you are?" One of the men sneered. Halfway through his sentence, Li Xian's expression turned cold. The man only felt his vision blur and his entire body was sent flying with a kick. At this moment, Li Xian seemed to have changed into a different person. No matter how he usually behaved, his identity as a young prince would never change. How could he let a prostitute from a brothel insult him like this? "You're courting death." The other men's expressions turned ugly when they saw this. Just as they were about to make a move, the madam immediately jogged over. "All of you stop. Li, what's going on?" She looked at Li Xian with a fawning expression and asked. Li Xian indifferently glanced at Li Yi, who was being held down by the two men. The madam immediately understood. She glared at the two men and said, "Hurry up and release him." Although the madam did not know Li Xian's identity, People like her knew best who they could offend and who they could not. The young man in front of her obviously belonged to the latter. The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. The sourness in Li Yi's heart at this moment could not be described with words. He did not even have the mood to visit the brothel anymore, and walked out without saying a word. Li Xian looked back at the woman, and a trace of doubt appeared on his face. Then he turned his head and chased after her. "Hey brother Li, wait for me." The place where her arm had been grabbed just now was still a little painful. The woman named Drunken Mo looked at the direction in which her face had left and murmured, "That scholar." While she was thinking about something, the madam had already walked over quickly and asked with concern, "Zuemo, are you okay?" The woman shook her head when she heard this. The madam's heart immediately calmed down. Any accident to the top artist of the Jade Courtyard would be a great loss to them. Whether it was in his previous life or this life, Li Yi had never touched a drop of alcohol, but at this moment he just wanted to get drunk. A toast to the past and never look back. The dead were dead and people always had to look forward. The faces of Xiao Huan, Lu Rui, and even Fang appeared in his mind. Li Yi took a deep breath and strode to a wine shop on the street. "Shopkeeper, bring me the strongest wine you have here." A fat shopkeeper came over and looked at Li Yi with a smile. "Young master, our strongest wine here is too strong, ordinary people. Cut the crap, are you afraid that I can't afford it?" A silver ingot had been slapped on the table by Li Yi. "Okay, wait a moment, young master, the wine will be here soon." When the shopkeeper saw the silver ingot, his eyes lit up and he hurried to the counter to get the wine. Li Xian walked in from outside and sat opposite to Li Yi. He looked at him and sighed, "No matter how beautiful that Miss Zuemo is, she is just a prostitute. Brother Li is a capable man, why do you insist on being a prostitute?" Although they had only had 2 short interactions, it was obvious that this little prince had already developed a lot of interest in Li Yi. If it weren't for this, with his identity, no matter how much he lowered his status, how could he call an ordinary person brother? "Sir, your wine is here." Li Xian obviously misunderstood, but Li Yi didn't want to explain. When the shopkeeper put the wine on the table, he picked up the jar and took a big gulp. Plop. Before falling on the table, Li Yi finally understood why he didn't drink before. Seeing this, Li Xian was stunned for a moment and then laughed out loud. "I didn't expect your alcohol tolerance to be so poor." He grabbed the jar of wine that Li Yi had just drunk from with one hand and gulped it down a few mouthfuls. Plop. The two of them leaned on the table in the same posture. When the shopkeeper saw this scene at the counter, he couldn't help but curl his lips. "You have such a poor alcohol tolerance, but you still dare to ask for the strongest wine. You deserve it." At the corner of a street not far from the wine shop, a few figures dressed in coarse clothes walked out from the darkness when they saw the 2 people lying drunk on the table in the wine shop. The corners of their mouths pulled into a bitter smile as they walked out. Chapter 51. When he regained consciousness a little, he felt that his whole head was swollen. He tried hard for a long time, but he couldn't open his eyes. He could only hear a few intermittent voices around him. Wang Fei actually ate something in the morning. She also specially drank a small bowl of yam and corn porridge. Wang Ye was very happy. He increased everyone's allowance in the kitchen. When he finally opened his eyes, he felt that his mouth was unusually bitter and thirsty. At this time, a clear voice sounded not far away. "Young master is awake." A hot towel was handed over. Li Yi carelessly wiped his face. He looked at the 2 maids standing in the room and said in a hoarse voice, "Water?" A moment later he took the teacup from the maid's hand and drank it in one gulp. He still didn't feel thirsty. After drinking a few cups, the feeling of thirst subsided a lot. At this time a maid came over with a tray covered with a red cloth. She said with a smile, "Young master, this is a thank you gift that Wang Ye asked me to prepare for you. Please accept it." "Thank you gift? What is it?" Li Yi had just woken up and his mind was not very clear. He casually removed the red cloth and was almost dazzled by the neat silver ingots on the tray. "Thank Wang Ye for me." Li Yi took the tray from the maid's hand with a face full of smiles. The trace of drowsiness was immediately swept away and he looked much more energetic. The maid was stunned when she heard this. It seemed that she didn't think that Li Yi would agree so readily. Just now, Wang Ye specifically told her that if the other party insisted on not accepting it, she must persuade him to accept it. For this, she had made a little preparation in her heart. But the real situation made her a little dazed. Didn't they say that scholars regarded money as dirt? This young master didn't seem to be like this. Li carried a small bag on his back and walked out of Ningguang Fu. He waved to the woman called Yanji behind him and strode away. Last night he drank a mouthful of wine and was drunk on the table. It was so shameful. He did not wait for the young prince to wake up and could not wait to leave the prince's mansion. There was a total of 110 taels of silver in the small bag he was carrying on his back. Although it was only about 50,000 renminbi, this was indeed the first large sum of money that Li Yi had received since he came to this era. The son of a nouveau riche must have a nouveau riche father. Li Yi liked this kind of forthright prince. It was too troublesome to talk about feelings. It was better to directly talk about money. His wallet was bulging and even his heart was filled. He just didn't know how anxious Fang and the others would be when they didn't see him yesterday. It was better to return to the stronghold as soon as possible. In the willow leaf stockade, the little servant girl sat in front of the door. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her beautiful big eyes had lost their spirit. She had 2 dark circles under her eyes and stared straight ahead. Not long after, a sturdy figure walked over from afar. The man surnamed Fang held a cloth bag in his hand. He walked in front of the servant girl, sighed and said, "Xiao Huan, this is the money from yesterday's candied haws. Take it back and keep it well." The young girl did not speak. She bit her lips and shook her head. The idea was given by the son-in-law, and the frosting was also bought by the son-in-law. We only put in a little effort. This money is not safe in our hands. You better keep it. Fang put the cloth bag at the feet of the young girl. In the end he did not say anything and turned to leave slowly. The young girl quietly sat in the familiar position. It seemed that there was still a figure beside her. Just like before, he told her those nice stories and taught her how to cook delicious food. That was almost the best time of her life. Thinking that the figure would never appear again, the young girl's nose could not help but feel a little sour. She forced herself not to let the tears fall. After all, she was only a 15 or 16-year-old girl. After an unknown amount of time, the tears in her eyes could no longer be controlled. She buried her little head between her legs and sobbed. "Xiao Huan, why are you crying? Who made you angry?" A voice suddenly came from the front. The young girl's body could not help but tremble. She suddenly raised her head and saw a familiar face that could not be more familiar. A glimmer of light suddenly appeared in the young girl's eyes, but it quickly dimmed. From yesterday until now, this scene had appeared countless times. From the surprise at the beginning to the numbness at the end, she knew that no matter how real an illusion was, it was still an illusion. Looking at the young servant girl's tearful face, Li Yi's heart could not help but ache. He quickly walked over and wiped the tears off her face. He softly said, "Tell me who bullied you. The son-in-law will help you vent your anger." The young girl stared blankly at Li Yi, helping her wipe away her tears. The real touch on her face made her realize that this was not an illusion. Son-in-law. In her beautiful big eyes, tears flowed out. In an instant, Li Yi felt that there was an additional delicate body in his arms. The usually shy servant girl would never do something like this. At this moment she was like a pear blossom in tears. She seemed to be using all her strength to hold onto his body, causing Li Yi to be a little confused. At this moment the courtyard door opened from the inside. Li Yi saw Lu Rui's figure appear. He pointed at the crying young servant girl and asked, "What's wrong with Xiao Huan?" Lu Rui stood at the door with his sword in his arms. He just looked at Li Yi. Although there was nothing strange on the surface, he seemed to have suddenly relaxed. The appearance of Lu Rui made Xiao Huan stop sobbing. She lowered her head and stood beside Li Yi with a blushing face. She tightly held onto the corner of his clothes, unwilling to let go. "Son-in-law." Fang's loud voice came from behind. Anyone could hear the boundless surprise in his voice. "Son-in-law, you're back." Seeing that Fang, who was so excited that he looked like he had married a few concubines, was about to give him a big bear hug, Li Yi immediately retreated far away with vigilance. He had just enjoyed Xiao Huan's soft embrace. He was unwilling to let Fang touch him no matter what. Fang was not angry that he did not get a bear hug. He looked at Li Yi and asked with a puzzled face, "Son-in-law, where did you go last night?" "Last night?" Li Yi said halfway before he realized that if he said that he went to the brothel to listen to music last night, it would be a little inappropriate. He changed the topic and said, "Last night? Last night I got lost in the city. I couldn't find you, so I stayed in the inn for the night and came back at dawn." From last night until today, Fang had always thought that if it were not for him, he would not have lost his son-in-law. He was deeply immersed in the torment in his heart and did not sleep for the whole night. It was only when he saw Li Yi today that all his self-blame and regret were swept away. He felt that his life was suddenly filled with light again. Li Yi took down the bundle on his shoulder and handed it to Xiao Huan. He instructed, "Take this back and put it in my cabinet." Xiao Huan stretched out her hand to take it, but she did not expect the small bundle to be much heavier than she had imagined. The bundle accidentally fell from her hand and fell to the ground. Whoosh! The bundle opened up and a pile of silver ingots rolled out. Under the sunlight, they almost dazzled Fang's eyes. Xiao Huan covered her mouth in shock. Her pretty face was filled with disbelief. Lu Rui could not help but tighten his grip on his sword. His expression changed. Not far away, Madame Wu walked out of the house. She had just poured out a basin of dirty water when she suddenly felt that the ground not far away from her was a little dazzling. She could not help but turn her head to look. Clang! The copper basin in her hand fell to the ground with a clear sound. Chapter 52. As a commoner who was afraid of poverty and starvation, Fang couldn't help but want to convert the silver into grain when he saw it. This had already become his instinctive reaction. But this time, when he saw the fist-sized silver ingots on the ground, Fang felt that his brain wasn't enough to process it. How much grain could this amount of silver buy was clearly beyond the scope of Fang's understanding, since his IQ was limited to adding and subtracting 10. Son-in-law, what did you do last night? Old Fang forcefully shifted his gaze away from the alluring silver ingots. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva with difficulty and looked at Li Yi as he asked. Li Yi glared at the careless maidservant girl and bent over to pick up the silver ingots on the ground one by one. He placed them in his bag and then raised his head to say, "I got lost last night and picked them up on the road." Picked them up. Fang's voice was trembling. This was almost 100 taels of silver. He wouldn't be able to earn so much money in his entire life, yet it was so casually picked up by the son-in-law? Even if he earned 100 copper coins a day from selling candied haws for the past few days, and he could get half of it, it would take several years for him to save up so much money without eating or drinking. As for the young maidservant girl, her beautiful big eyes sparkled with little stars. The son-in-law's luck had always been good. Every time he went out, he would always pick up something. Although it had been a long time since he had picked up a pheasant, he had picked up so much silver this time. Even the heavens were helping the son-in-law. The young maiden's mood had experienced great ups and downs overnight. At this moment, her heart was filled with joy. She secretly looked at Li Yi and couldn't bear to look away. Seeing Li Yi and the others walk into the courtyard, Madame Wu stood there in a daze. She felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Until now, she still couldn't believe what she had just seen. That's a lot of shiny silver. She probably wouldn't be able to see so much silver in her next life. For those poor families who still had to fill their stomachs, their annual expenses were only about 1 tael of silver. That amount of silver was enough for them to spend for the rest of their lives. After an unknown amount of time, Madame Wu finally recovered from her daze. She picked up the copper basin from the ground and walked into the room in a daze with an unknown expression on her face. 100 taels of silver was not a small sum, and how to spend it was still a problem. Naturally, Li Yi would not be like Fang and the others. The first thing he thought of when he had money was to buy food. Under the situation where there was no shortage of food at home, what he needed to consider was of course how to make the most of the money, how to use the 100 taels of silver to make more money. After all, no one could guarantee that he would always meet a rich man like Prince Ning and his son. Silver was common, but tycoons were rare. If he wanted to earn enough money to enjoy his old age, he had to rely on himself. Originally, he wanted to slowly accumulate enough money through the candied haws, but changes often came faster than he planned. Now that he had some assets, he could obviously skip this step. However, the candied haws business still had to continue. At least in the short term, there was still a lot of profit to be made from the candied haws without any market competition. Of course, there was another important reason. Although the money was nothing to him, it was enough to change the lives of Fang and the others for the rest of their lives. Li Yi did not want to lead the entire village out of poverty and become rich, but Fang and the others were his people. He couldn't just watch them eat dirt while he lived a luxurious life. Li Yi's only dream at this stage was to earn money, a lot of money. At least it would be enough for him to retire for the rest of his life. As for the specific amount of money, Li Yi did not have a number in his mind. In short, the more the better. With a starting capital of 100 taels, according to Li Yi's previous plan, he could consider purifying high alcohol content or making soap to make money. Before distillation and purification was invented, The alcohol content in this world was actually very low. Most of the rice wine was below 10 degrees, and the highest was no more than 20 degrees. It was only under this premise that it was possible to not get drunk after 1,000 cups. If it was the white wine with 50 to 60 degrees in the future, those so-called wine heroes would have died of alcohol poisoning many times before they could drink 1,000 cups. The alcohol content of the wine that the shopkeeper brought out last night should not be very high. How could it encounter someone like Li Yi who would faint at the slightest smell of alcohol? He was knocked out in one gulp after drinking it. The wine culture was also very prosperous in this world. The higher the alcohol content of the wine, the more they sought after it. Presumably, this would also be an unimpeded way to make money. The sterilization and disinfection of wounds also required high alcohol content. Li Yi still cherished his life very much. If a modern person died from an infected wound in the future, it would be a great shame. Apart from distilling the alcohol, the production of soap had to be put on the agenda as soon as possible. The legendary thing called pancreas, which was used for bathing, was also very rare in this world. Li Yi had specially looked for it in the market of the prefectural city, but he did not see anyone selling it. After asking, he found out that the production method of pancreas was very complicated. The secret recipe was also in the hands of the royal family and very few people. It was a luxury that only a few people could use, and it was basically impossible to see it in the market. Even if it did appear, it would be quickly bought at a high price. Something that couldn't be more ordinary in the future had immediately become a luxury in this world. This was naturally a good thing for Li Yi. In the past, he had also personally DIY handmade soap with the mentality of playing around. It did not require many materials and the process was also not complicated. Even now, he still remembered the production method. The simplest handmade soap could be made with water, vegetable oil, and sodium hydroxide. The soap made with this method did not contain any additives, had a strong ability to remove dirt, and did not cause any harm to the human skin. Although there was no ready-made sodium hydroxide, it could be easily produced with slaked lime and soda ash. There was no difficulty. After thinking about it in his heart, Li Yi decided to start with handmade soap. He had really had enough of the days where he had to rely on his hands to bathe. As he was thinking about how to carry out this plan, he unknowingly walked into the inner courtyard. Suddenly he heard a strange sound. Li Yi raised his head and saw a graceful figure moving around in the courtyard. A long sword that shone with a cold light was as agile as a snake. Seeing Lu Rui draw a beautiful flower with the sword and jump several feet away, Li Yi's heart was filled with extreme envy. If he could also have such skills, would he still be afraid of being bullied? If he encountered that scar-faced man again, he could easily deal with him by himself. At that time, with his extraordinary skills and pretty face, wouldn't he be able to become a handsome man with both the pen and the sword, easily gain a large group of female fans, and easily reach the peak of life? Looking at Li Yi's face from afar, Lu Rui sheathed his long sword and resisted the urge to kill him with one strike. Chapter 53. When he was young, Li Yi, like other boys, had dreams of being a Wuxia. He had dreamed countless times that he could learn the best kung fu in the world and become a hero. He could fight against the strong and help the weak, travel the world with his sword, and leave a legend of chivalry in Jianghu. Especially after he came into contact with all kinds of wuxia novels and TV series, this idea became stronger and stronger. However, as he grew older, his thinking became less childish, and this idea gradually faded. In the 21st century, there was no wuxia Jianghu. As long as he was an adult with a normal brain, he would not always think about these illusory things like when he was young. But it was different here. In this world, Jianghu really existed. Although, wherever there are people, there is Jianghu, the definition of Jianghu here was very broad. But the Jianghu in this world was a real Jianghu with swords and heroes. Here, individual strength was extremely magnified. Even a small willow leaf village could be called a place with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Like Fang and the others, they looked like simple and honest farmers, but when they really fought with others, they were all good fighters who could fight against 10. Even his wife and sister-in-law were martial arts masters with extraordinary skills. Li Yi saw them practice kung fu every day, and the little tricks they showed inadvertently would make Li Yi's jaw drop. It was a piece of cake for them to break a wooden table with their bare hands. Li Yi felt that it would be no problem for Lu Rui to break a big stone on her chest. Thinking about it, he still felt that it was not suitable for her to practice. Her chest was already flat enough, and if it was pressed by the stone, there would be nothing left. Li Yi should be very lucky that Lu Rui could not hear what he was thinking. otherwise she would have already taken out her sword and hacked at him. After thinking carefully, Li Yi sadly found that in the whole family in terms of fighting ability, he could only beat Xiao Huan. As a man, was there anything more shameful than this? No, in the family there were more women than men. If he was not more domineering and powerful, he would be suppressed for the rest of his life. Rui. Li Yi looked at Lu Rui with a smile, trying to make his voice as gentle as possible. Rui had never seen such an attitude from Li Yi, so he immediately raised his guard against him. He looked at him from afar and made a defensive posture. Li Yi's face darkened when he saw that he was about to make a move just because he called out her name. If not for the fact that he had a favor to ask, he really wanted to turn around and leave. What is it? Lu Rui looked at him and asked straightforwardly. I want to learn martial arts. This time, Li Yi didn't beat around the bush and answered straightforwardly. Practice martial arts? Lu Rui looked at him with a different expression. Why? Li Yi was stunned when he heard that, but he still said honestly, I just want to practice martial arts. I've admired martial artists since I was young, but I never had the chance to practice. No. To Li Yi's surprise, Lu Rui shook her head quickly. What? It was his turn to be confused. Your aptitude is too low, Lu Rui said bluntly. Li Yi was stunned when he heard that, then he felt indignant. He was a transmigrator after all, and he had the halo of a protagonist. He was destined to be the man who changed the world, and he would succeed no matter what he did. He just wanted to practice martial arts, but he was told that his aptitude was too low? That didn't fit the plot of a protagonist at all. However, it was impossible for him to give up just like that. A thought flashed through his mind and he looked at Lu Rui and said, Why don't we make a bet? No. Lu Rui said straightforwardly, and Li Yi's words were stuck in his throat. Li Yi looked at her angrily. She always didn't play by the rules. Could they still have a pleasant conversation? If I lose, I'll give you 50 taels of silver. If you lose, you have to teach me martial arts. Li Yi didn't care whether she rejected it or not. He really didn't believe that Lu Rui could resist the temptation of 50 taels of silver. Sure enough, after hearing Li Yi's bet, Lu Rui raised her eyebrows and she seemed to be tempted. 50 taels of silver was indeed not a small amount of money for her, and she could buy many things she wanted. She had never had so much money in her life. However, she also knew that since Li Yi said that, he must have the confidence to win. Based on her understanding of Li Yi, he wouldn't do things that he wasn't confident about. Li Yi knew what she was thinking at a glance. He smiled and said, Don't worry. I won't ask you to recite poems or paint, and I won't ask you to do anything difficult. After saying that, he stood up and picked up 2 stones of different sizes from the corner of the yard. He held them in his hands and raised his arms to the same height. He looked at Lu Rui and said, You just need to guess which of these 2 stones will fall first when I let go. If you guess right, I lose and I'll give you the 50 taels of silver. If you guess wrong, you must fulfill your promise and teach me martial arts. The bet was very simple, but when Li Yi said it, Lu Rui still had some doubts in her heart. Of course, she didn't doubt herself, but she doubted Li Yi's intelligence. When 2 stones fell from the same height, it was common knowledge that the heavier one would fall first. Was there a need to bet? This bet was a situation where she would definitely win. If it wasn't for the elusive smile on Li Yi's face, Lu Rui would have suspected that he was really out of his mind and wanted to give her 50 taels of silver for nothing. She didn't worry that Li Yi would play any tricks. At such a close distance, no matter what Li Yi did, he wouldn't be able to escape her eyes. What, do you dare to bet? Li Yi looked at Lu Rui and said provocatively. Why not? Lu Rui glanced at him and said lightly. She couldn't lose this bet no matter what. Why would she go against the money? Let's make a promise. Li Yi put down the stone and raised his hand. Plop. Lu Rui frowned, but she still reached out her hand and gave him a high five. Let's begin. I'm guessing that the stone in your left hand will fall first. Lu Rui was referring to the bigger stone. Don't rush. Li Yi didn't start immediately. He said with a serious face, I have to get Xiao Huan to witness it. Otherwise, if you go back on your words, who am I going to talk to? Lu Rui couldn't suppress the urge to slash him with her sword again. After a while, the servant girl stood beside them. She looked at Li Yi, then at Lu Rui and said, Young master, second miss, we can start now. After that, she focused all her attention on Li Yi's hands. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. Young master's 50 taels of silver was probably going to be gone this time. Even Xiao Huan knew that the big stone would fall first. How could second miss be wrong? Watch carefully. Li Yi raised his arms to the same height and revealed an unnoticeable smile. He let go of his hands and the 2 stones fell to the ground. Bang! 2 stones fell from the sky and hit the bluestone slabs, making only a single sound. How is this possible? Upon seeing this scene, Lu Rui could not help but exclaim in astonishment. Chapter 54. That's impossible. Lu Rui's eyes widened. She was no longer as calm as before as she shook her head. The young maidservant beside her also opened her mouth in shock. She was not any less surprised than Lu Rui. When falling from the same height, a heavy object would definitely fall before a light object. This was a concept that had been deeply ingrained in their minds for more than 10 years. However, the 2 of them clearly saw that the 2 stones of different sizes had clearly fallen at the same time. You must be cheating. Lu Rui looked up at Li Yi and said with certainty. I knew you'd say that. Li Yi shrugged and said nonchalantly, try it yourself if you don't believe me. If the law of free fall could produce a different result from Lu Rui's hands, then it would not matter even if he lost 50 taels of silver to her. In another world, Aristotle once proposed the conclusion that heavier objects fall faster, with his enigmatic self-confidence, which dominated the Western academic world for nearly 2,000 years. One day 2,000 years later, Galileo walked up to the Leaning Tower of Pisa and threw 2 iron balls of different weights down. He proved the law of free fall with the 2 balls experiment. Similarly, in the current world, the principle that could be understood with a small experiment was also not discovered because of the ancient people's taken-for-granted concept. Lu Rui picked up another 2 stones to experiment with. When she saw the 2 stones fall to the ground at the same time in her hands, she was stunned. Then she clenched her teeth and said, Xiao Huan, try it. The reason why the law was a law was that it would not change due to objective conditions. Lu Rui was destined to fail if she wanted to challenge the law of nature. Why? Why is it like this? From afar, Li Yi felt a little guilty as he watched Lu Rui mutter those words in a daze. It was as though the worldview she had built up over a long period of time was beginning to crumble. Was it too despicable to use such a method to deceive a weak lady? No, his sister-in-law was not a weak woman. If such a woman could become a weak woman, then the world would have been ruled by women long ago. You lost the bet. Can you teach me martial arts now? Li Yi walked over and said to Lu Rui with a smile. Why? Lu Rui looked up at him and asked through gritted teeth, why did the 2 stones fall to the ground at the same time? For the current her, winning or losing was not important. What was important was that the creed that had existed in her heart over the years had undergone an earth-shattering change. She needed to know the reason behind it. Xiao Huan also stared wide-eyed at Li Yi, her big eyes filled with the light of curiosity. It was indeed difficult for Li Yi to explain the origin of the law of free fall. Basic physics had not yet been established in this world, and it would be even more troublesome to explain the knowledge of acceleration to them. He thought about it and said, you can think of it as saying that the speed of the falling stone has nothing to do with the weight of the stone. No matter how different the weight of the 2 stones is, if they fall from the same height, they will always hit the ground at the same time. This explanation was actually the same as no explanation at all. You only know part of it, don't you? After listening to Li Yi's explanation, Lu Rui looked at him with disdain. As a good young man who had received higher education, how could he be looked down upon by an ignorant woman in a feudal society? Li Yi looked at her and asked, do you know where the river flows from the back of the mountain? Nonsense, of course it flows down the mountain. Lu Rui said bluntly. What? Li Yi looked at her and asked, why does the river always flow down the mountain and not up the mountain? Because. Lu Rui subconsciously opened her mouth to explain. However, the moment she said that word, she was unable to continue. Water flows from a high place to a low place. Was there a need for a reason? Li Yi's questions did not stop there. Why do the leaves on the tree always fall to the ground and not fly to the sky? Why can I see my own shadow in the water? Why are the colors of the rainbow after the rain always red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue and purple? One question after another came out of Li Yi's mouth like a machine gun. Lu Rui opened her mouth for a moment and then closed it again. She was completely stunned. In autumn, the leaves on the tree would fall to the ground, one could see their own shadow in the water, and the order of the colors of the rainbow. Weren't these things natural? Did these need to be explained? But why? Lu Rui and Xiao Huan stood in the courtyard and questions began to appear in their minds. Li Yi's words seemed to have opened the door to a new world for them. It turned out that these small things that they did not pay attention to were not as simple as they seemed. Even in the small things, there is a great knowledge hidden. And in this world, not every problem has an explanation. Li Yi felt a slight sense of achievement as he enlightened the two of them on natural science for free. Young master, why are these things? The little servant girl looked up at Li Yi and asked in a daze. Li Yi, since she was willing to bet, she had to be willing to accept her loss. Second, Miss Lu's character was still very trustworthy. In the inner courtyard, Li Yi sat on a stone bench and looked at Lu Rui, who was obviously unhappy. He asked excitedly, "Do you know the 18 dragons subduing palms?" "What's the 18 dragons subduing palms?" Lu Rui frowned and asked. "It's the world's most ferocious palm technique. There's a dragon's roar when it's used. The wonders of the palm technique are unparalleled in the world," Li Yi explained with glowing eyes. "I've never heard of it," Lu Rui said lightly. "What about the 6-pulse magical sword? Gather all the vital qi at the tip of the finger and release it through the air. It can seal the enemy's acupoints at close range and injure people with qi from afar. It's the world's top exquisite sword technique." "I've never heard of it. Have you heard of the wave-like subtle steps? After mastering it, your body will be as light as a swallow. You can run on walls and walk on water." "I've never heard of this either." "Then you must have heard of Tai Chi. It's used to defeat the strong with the weak, overcome the strong with softness, complement each other with softness, borrow strength to fight strength, and move 1,000 pounds with little effort." After Li Yi finished, Lu Rui looked at him with a frown and said, "I've never heard of anyone in Jianghu who has mastered the wonderful martial arts you mentioned. The 18 dragons subduing palms, the 6-pulse divine sword, the Tai Chi fist. According to what you said, even one of these supreme martial arts is enough to dominate Jianghu. However, no one in Jianghu can do any of them. Let's not talk about other things for now. Just the release of true qi alone is something that even a grandmaster expert would not be able to do." "Ah, there's none of these?" Li Yi's face showed an unconcealable disappointment. After all this time, the so-called martial arts masters in this world were not just a little bit different from the masters in old Master Jin's martial arts world. "Where did you hear about these martial arts?" Lu Rui looked up at him with a hint of doubt in her beautiful eyes. "It's a long story, tell me about it for now." All right," Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "It's said that in the southern Song dynasty, in the last years of the previous dynasty, there were 5 supreme martial arts masters in Jianghu. They fought on the top of Mount Hua for the 9-yin manual, the world's best martial arts book. The battle lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, until the sun and the moon lost their light and the sky lost their color. Chapter 55. Under the warm autumn sun, the handsome scholar lazily reclined on a stone bench. His magnetic voice reverberated in the small courtyard. A story named The Legend of the Condor Heroes had been changed and its background had been reset. This was the first time that it had appeared in this world. 5 ultimate skills. Hua Mountain Sword Competition. 9-yin manual. As he continued to tell the story, the beautiful girl opposite him had an indifferent expression at first. After a while, her expression gradually changed, and she involuntarily fell into the wonderful story. She had been practicing martial arts since she was a child and had always been interested in the martial arts world. However, growing up in the village, she did not have the chance to come into contact with these things. She only heard a few words from other people and she felt that the so-called Jianghu was nothing more than this. But at this moment, a real Jianghu that matched her expectations was taking shape in her mind and gradually spreading out. At a certain moment, another baby-faced girl walked out of the room and looked at them from afar. She murmured in a low voice, "Young master and second miss, what are they talking about?" A puzzled expression appeared on her pretty face and she walked over curiously. After a long period of training, Li Yi's storytelling skills had been perfected. If he could no longer make a living in the future, other than moving a table to sell paintings on the street, he could also consider going to a theater to tell stories. Unknowingly, he had another way to make a living. In the Jianghu, it was not a burden to have more skills. Even Lu Rui, an otherworldly woman, could be attracted by him. She was attracted by the stories of old Master Jin, and this made his self-confidence a little inflated. Although Li Yi did not produce stories and he was only a storyteller, who knew? Lu Rui had never heard of those exquisite martial arts, the martial arts gangs that she had never heard of, and even the names of the top masters in the stories. Although the previous dynasty was decades ago, it was not like Lu Rui did not understand it. The situation of the world back then was different from what Li Yi had revealed. If that was the case, he had fabricated everything out of thin air? However, even though he clearly knew nothing about martial arts, Some of his deductions had clearly reached a very profound realm. It even made her feel enlightened. Occasionally, she was enlightened, and her martial arts cultivation even showed signs of advancing to the next level. That's all for today. When are you going to teach me martial arts? The legend of the Condor heroes wasn't something that could be finished in a day. Even if he could read the original version in his mind, he would get bored after a long time. Let's talk about this in a few days. Although Rui was still very curious about the development of the story, the most important thing at the moment was to digest those insights. He waved his hand at Li Yi impatiently and hurried back to his room. You, Li Yi looked at her back in a daze. She left after listening to the story. Didn't she say that she was willing to admit defeat? Burning the bridge after crossing the river, getting rid of the donkey when it was no longer of use. What kind of people were these? In the end, Lu Rui did not leave Li Yi alone. She casually threw him a book about the basics of martial arts and let him practice by himself. Having such an irresponsible sister-in-law, Li Yi couldn't do anything about it. Fortunately, he could absorb the books in the real world into his mind. After absorbing this basic martial art, he could quickly master the moves inside. However, it was just the form and nothing more. The might of these moves could only be revealed when paired with a unique mental cultivation method. Furthermore, it required vigorous inner energy as a foundation. Only having moves but no inner energy in one's body could only be regarded as a superficial display. If one encountered a slightly more powerful opponent, this little bit of skill would not be enough. Unfortunately, the cultivation of inner chi could not be achieved overnight. It could only be accumulated over a long period of time and slowly increased. This made Li Yi's dream of becoming a top master in a short period of time become a bubble. Even so, his learning ability still shocked Lu Rui. She still remembered that it took her a whole month to completely master these basic moves. On the other hand, Li Yi only used less than a day. In terms of the degree of control, he seemed to be more skillful than she was at that time. The difference between a day and a month was like the difference between heaven and earth. This made Lu Rui suffer a huge blow. She could not help but have some doubts in her heart. Could it be that he was really a martial arts genius that appeared once in a century? In terms of poetry and painting, she was definitely not as good as Li Yi. However, Li Yi did not know martial arts. This was one of the few things that Lu Rui could find confidence in from him, but now she did not even have this confidence anymore. If Li Yi knew what Lu Rui was thinking, he would probably be very proud. However, he could not be proud at this moment. There was no other reason. Since the beginning of autumn, the number of mosquitoes in the room had increased. Unless he kept hiding in the gauze curtains, his exposed skin would be bitten into big bumps after a while. It was not a big deal to be bitten by mosquitoes. It was not that Li Yi had not been bitten by mosquitoes before. However, he did not know the physique of this body that he had transmigrated to. When others were bitten, there would at most be a small red dot or a small bump. However, when Li Yi was bitten, there would immediately be a big bump on that area. It was extremely itchy and unbearable. In the evening, he did not dare to step into the room anymore. He sat on a stone not far from the door. Because of the wind outside, there were no mosquitoes. In this backward era, mosquito-repellent incense had not been invented yet. The most common way to repel mosquitoes was to hang a sachet in the room. The sachet was filled with mosquito-repellent herbs such as agastache, peppermint, basil, calamus, citronella, and so on. Li Yi had also tried this method, but the effect was not obvious. Moreover, Li Yi himself could not stand the smell. He was afraid that before the mosquitoes were smoked away, Li Yi himself would be suffocated to death. If only there was a bottle of 6 Gods floral water. At this moment, Li Yi missed the mosquito-repellent artifact from his previous life. People always know how to cherish things after they have lost them. A box of mosquito-repellent incense and a bottle of floral water could help him get out of the sea of suffering, but this small request could only be extravagant hope. By the way, if there is no ready-made one, I can make it myself. After a while, Li Yi patted his head and said in sudden realization. His head was filled with books from the entire provincial library. Would he be afraid of not being able to find the formula for the mosquito repellent? Chemistry. Lifestyle. The next moment, Li Yi's consciousness sank into his mind. His eyes swept across the rows of bookshelves, and pieces of messy information poured into his mind. After an unknown amount of time, Li Yi suddenly slapped his thigh and exclaimed, "Found it!" It was also at this moment that the sound of footsteps came into his ears. When he raised his head, he saw Fang's familiar face. "What's wrong? Were you beaten by your wife again?" Seeing the unconcealable sadness on Fang's face, Li Yi temporarily forgot about the mosquito repellent and asked. Chapter 56. In fact, Fang's wife could be regarded as a strange woman. She usually looked like a simple peasant woman, but when she beat up old Fang, she immediately became a heroine of the generation. Li Yi could feel the thick murderous aura from her even from afar. Although Lao Fang seemed to be troubled by something today, there were no bruises on his face. Presumably, it wasn't because of his fierce wife at home. Fang shook his head, indicating that he got along well with his wife at home today, and sat down next to Li Yi. Then there is something wrong with the Tanghulu business. Li Yi slapped a mosquito that had just landed on his arm and said, "What's wrong? Are there already many people on the street who are imitating our candied haws?" "How did you know?" Fang suddenly jumped up from the ground and looked at Li Yi in surprise as if he had seen a ghost. Li Yi flicked away the dead mosquito in his hand and pointed to the front. Fang looked in the direction of his finger and saw several people carrying Tanghulu on their shoulders passing by. When passing by, they looked at Li Yi and Fang a few times, and there was no lack of complacency on their faces. Bah! Fang spat at the backs of these people and scolded, "Shameless guys. This idea was obviously the son-in-law's idea. Why did they also sell Tanghulu? If there was a patent in this world, Fang would have long been unable to help but go to the government to sue them." These people were the direct descendants of Lu's family. At first, they looked down on Fang and the others for not doing the right thing and taking the crooked way to sell Tanghulu. But later, they saw that their lives were getting richer and richer, and even found that Fang's children had become stronger after a few days. Only then did they realize that what Fang and the others were doing was really a money-making job. No one would say no to money. Those who had secretly despised Fang and the others before began to imitate them in a few days and began to sell Tanghulu. The method of making Tanghulu was really simple, and one could understand it with a few glances. Therefore there were several Tanghulu workshops in the stockade overnight. Although they did not learn some of Li Yi's unique skills, it would not affect them too much if their taste was a little worse. Fang was extremely resentful of their shameless behavior. But he could only be angry. After all, there was no law in the Jing kingdom that clearly prohibited them from selling Tanghulu, which was also what made Fang depressed. "I'm afraid that they are not the only ones who imitate them, right?" Li Yi asked again. Fang looked at Li Yi with a surprised look again. He knew what was going on in the world without going out. He felt that Li Yi was more and more mysterious. He nodded and said, "Since a few days ago there have been more people selling Tanghulu on the street. Previously we could sell all of our Tanghulu in less than 2 hours. But today, after shouting for a whole day, there are still half of them left." The Tanghulu business carried Fang's lofty dream, beautiful wives and a big house. Now, his hope was mercilessly extinguished just as it sprouted. The bitterness was really indescribable. Such a situation was not out of Li Yi's expectation. On the contrary, these things were all within his expectations. Never underestimate the ability of human beings to imitate, not to mention the Tanghulu business, which did not require much technical content. After seeing the business opportunity, it was not strange that so many people would follow the trend. Li Yi did not intend to do the Tanghulu business for the rest of his life. But so far there was still a lot of profit in this area. He looked up at the man surnamed Fang, sighed and said, "Fang, how many times have I said that you can't do things recklessly? You have to use your brain. Not only can you not marry a beautiful concubine, but you also can't buy a big house for the rest of your life." Fang's face turned red. He looked around and did not find his wife. He glared and said, "Who wants to marry a concubine? My wife is enough." It seemed that it was impossible to count on Fang to use his brain to think of a solution. Li Yi waved to him helplessly and said, "Come here. Next, you have to do this." Fang was overjoyed and hurriedly put his ear to it. After a while, Fang looked at Li Yi with a dull face and could not say a word for a long time. Looking at Li Yi and then at himself, Fang began to have a question in his heart. They were all born and raised by their parents, but why was there such a big difference between them? "I think the son-in-law is not a good person." Thinking of what Li Yi had said to him just now, Fang gave Li Yi a thumbs up with admiration. "Get out." Li Yi kicked Fang's butt. Even when this guy praises people, he is so unique. In the next few days, many people in the stockade had already taken selling Tanghulu as their main business. However, after a few days, everyone found that the Tanghulu business was getting more and more difficult. There was no other reason than the number of vendors selling Tanghulu increased day by day. They could be seen on every street in Qing'an Prefecture. Under such fierce competition and the fact that their candied haws weren't that outstanding, their business naturally worsened. In the end, they could only sell a few skewers a day. Then, at some unknown time, the number of vendors selling tanghulu suddenly decreased at an alarming rate. This was because they could no longer buy hawthorn fruits. When they asked the hawthorn peddlers, they learned that just a few days ago, all the hawthorn in the entire Qing'an prefectural city had been bought by someone at a low price. In other words, they wouldn't be able to find hawthorn to make candied haws in the short term. This situation did not continue for long. Just 2 days later, a few hawthorn vendors suddenly appeared in the city. Naturally, it quickly caused a commotion among the crowd. Although the price of these hawthorn fruits was more than 3 times higher than before, after they were made into tanghulu, there was still a certain amount of profit to be made. The crowd cursed the simple and honest-looking men in their hearts for first stocking up and then taking the opportunity to raise the price of the hawthorn fruits. However, they could only grit their teeth and buy. After all, this was already the only place in the city that sold hawthorn fruits. However, because of this, the competition between these people also increased. Ever since the first person began to lower the price in order to sell more, the price of tanghulu plummeted until 1 copper coin could buy a skewer of tanghulu. The profits in this business had also reached a freezing point. It was also at this time that a new type of tanghulu suddenly appeared in the city and once again caused a rush to buy it. The raw material of this tanghulu was not hawthorn but fresh, seasonal fruit. It was cut into small pieces, coated with icing sugar and then skewered. It was even more delicious than the tanghulu made from hawthorn. This type of loose tanghulu quickly opened up a market in Qing'an Prefecture. Those who were observant noticed that the first tanghulu to appear in the city came from the hands of these people. And in terms of taste, their tanghulu was a notch better than the other vendors. This was a kind of brand effect. Even though there were others who imitated the new style of candied haws, it was difficult for them to pose a threat to the Lu family's candied haws. Their simple and honest faces seemed to have become the symbol of authentic candied haws in Qing'an Prefecture. Creak. Li had just finished teaching the naughty children. Not long after he returned home, the door to the small courtyard was pushed open from the outside. Fang and a few men walked in with smiles on their faces. Chapter 57. Fang took out a big bag from his back and said, "Son-in-law, this is the money we've earned from selling red fruits and candied haws these days. According to our initial agreement, we'll split it in half. This is the remaining half." It had to be said that Fang and the others were a group of very honest people. Although they were the ones who worked hard to sell candied haws, the candied haws were invented by Li Yi. In the beginning, he was the one who gave them the money. Even when they encountered various problems later on, he was the one who helped them solve them. Without Li Yi, they wouldn't be where they were today. They understood all this. Son-in-law could have done these things without them, but because of his relationship with Miss, he took care of them. Everything was remembered by Fang and the others. At first, when they heard that son-in-law wanted to split half of the profits with them, Fang and the others were shocked at first, then they became terrified. They had only done a little bit of work. What right did they have to take so much? However, they insisted on only taking 10% of the profits, which was eventually rejected by Li Yi. Fang could never imagine that the reason why Li Yi's impression of him changed was because of the 2 pheasants. Perhaps all of them should be grateful to the 2 pheasants. In the courtyard, when Xiao Huan and Lu Rui saw Fang open the bag and revealed the copper coins inside, their pretty faces went blank for a moment. They knew that it was Li Yi's idea that the big man surnamed Fang and the others had been working on the candied haws business these days. They were only a little curious, but they didn't take it to heart. Last time, Fang sent a small bag of copper coins to Xiao Huan, saying that it was the profit from selling candied haws. It was about a few hundred copper coins. At that time, Xiao Huan only thought that son-in-law had found a way to make money for Uncle Fang and the others, and they wouldn't have to live so hard in the future. She was very happy. But she didn't expect that they would make so much money in just a few days. If they only sold candied haws like before, they naturally wouldn't make so much money. But what Xiao Huan and Lu Rui didn't know was that Fang and the others had been doing more than this these days. First, he listened to Li Yi and bought a large amount of hawthorns, almost emptying out the hawthorns in Qing'an Prefectural City. A few days later, he sold them at several times the original price and made a huge profit. Not only that, but even the unripened hawthorn fruits in the back of the mountain were all plucked by them, taking advantage of this craze to sell. More than half of the copper coins in front of him were actually the profits from selling hawthorn fruits. In addition, they took advantage of the fact that the price of the hawthorn sugar-coated haws had dropped to the freezing point and there was no longer any profit to be made. They decisively launched a new type of fruit sugar-coated haws, which was well received. Before all the vendors could react, they had made a fortune. All of this was, of course, Li Yi's idea. And now, although there were many imitations of the new type of sugar-coated haws, because they had long established the Lu's sugar-coated haws brand, they had a natural advantage. Their business was still very good and every day their goods would be sold out. Until now there was a steady income every day. If this business could continue for a long time, their lives would definitely get better and better. They didn't have to go back to the days where they had to worry about filling their stomachs every day. They had meat and rice every day and their family gradually had a small amount of savings. In a short period of time, they had suddenly moved from the bottom of the willow leaf village to a well-off level. Not to mention the tenant farmers who used to be at the same level as them, even the direct descendants of the Lus who had a slightly more well-off life were now far behind them. Who could have imagined such a life in the past? Because of this, these people were full of gratitude towards Li Yi. If it weren't for him, they might still be working for others and living a life where they didn't know the next meal. Have you bought all the things that I asked you to buy in the prefecture? Li Yi didn't refuse the money sent by Fang and the others. After all, in the following period of time he really needed money. I've bought all the bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices and wine. I'll send them to you in a moment. Fang nodded and said. Although he was still very curious about the use of those things that the son-in-law asked him to buy, now Fang admired Li Yi from the bottom of his heart. The things that needed to be done would be done by the son-in-law. As for the rest he could leave it to him. By the way, there's one more thing. Li Yi looked up at Fang and the others and said, the sugar-coated haws business can be handed over to your in-laws in the future. If you have any trustworthy relatives, you can also let them participate. Hearing this, Fang was stunned and asked, then what should we do? The others also had a puzzled look on their faces. Don't worry, I won't let you guys be idle, Li Yi said with a smile. Letting Fang and the others sell sugar-coated haws on the streets was really overkill. It was a great waste of talent. What Li Yi was going to do next would be the time where they would really be useful. Although Li Yi didn't explain in detail, Fang still nodded without hesitation. All right, I'll let my in-laws know when I get back. The others didn't have any objections to this. This powerful execution that stemmed from trust left Lu Rui secretly alarmed as she watched from the side. He turned his head and looked at Li Yi with a surprised expression. He had only been in the village for a short period of time, but he had already completely convinced these guys. Not long after, the burly man surnamed Fang and the others walked out of the courtyard. Walking in the village, along the way, many of the direct descendants of the Lu family looked at them with rather unfriendly eyes. There was no other reason, it was because their sugar-coated haws had all gone bankrupt. Nowadays, an ordinary sugar-coated haw could only be sold for a copper coin. The profits were far less than before. Even if it was a copper coin, they couldn't sell much in a day. In the current Qing and prefecture, the faces of Fang and the others were the only indication of authentic sugar-coated haws. Only the Lu family's sugar-coated haws were still as popular as before. Of course, compared to others, their sugar-coated haws had more variety and the taste was more delicious. This was also the reason why the Lu family's sugar-coated haws had always been popular. As for the Lu family's sugar-coated haws, of course, it wasn't a name that just anyone with the surname Lu could use. Even though they wanted to imitate it, the taste they made was far from the others. It was only now that everyone understood that this seemingly simple sugar-coated haw probably had some unique secret method that they didn't know about. If they wanted to make a fortune with sugar-coated haws, they had to get Fang's secret recipe. However, the direct descendants had always been at odds with each other. Of course, Fang wouldn't tell them the secret recipe for free. Seeing that the people they didn't even need to look at when they went out in the past were now living a life that even they were envious of, more of the Lu family members began to regret. If they hadn't been so against Lu's sister Rui, how could this situation have happened? Back then, for the sake of a small profit, they had made things difficult for the Lu sisters. Now they had lost this rare opportunity to make a fortune. Only the Lu family members could understand how they felt. At this moment, their minds once again thought of the scholar that they had looked down upon. Everyone's hearts were filled with complicated emotions. Chapter 58. Son-in-law, take a look. Did you miss anything? Fang walked in from the outside carrying a large bag, took out the things inside and placed them in front of Li Yi. bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices, a few jars of wine that old Fang had bought from the prefecture city. Looking at the pile of items in front of him, Li Yi counted them and nodded. Old Fang was very reliable. He did not miss out on any of the items that he had been instructed to buy. As the autumn deepened, the mosquitoes became even more rampant when night fell. For this body with a special physique, every night was the most torturous time for Li Yi. Now that the candied Ha's business was on the right track, Fang and a few others could handle it. There was no need for Li Yi to worry more. He finally had time to solve the biggest problem that troubled him. Son-in-law, it's not New Year's Day. Why did you buy so much wine? Fang's gaze was fixed on the wine jar on the ground. He involuntarily swallowed a mouthful of saliva and looked at Li Yi. In the past, when the family had no money, there were only a few times a year when they were willing to spend a few coins to buy a bowl of wine at the wine shop in the market at the foot of the mountain to satisfy their cravings. The taste was enough to be remembered for several days. Although he did not have to worry about food and clothing these days and had a lot of surplus, Fang, who was afraid of poverty, was still very thrifty in life. It was easy to earn copper money, but it was harder for him to spend it. Naturally, it was impossible for him to be extravagant enough to enjoy wine and meat all day long. Who said it's not New Year's Day? Li Yi raised his eyebrows, looked back at Fang and said, Isn't it the Mid-Autumn Festival in a few days? These days I have been busy with the candied Ha's business. Everyone has worked hard. I will reward everyone. When Fang heard this, his eyes suddenly lit up. Is this wine for the Mid-Autumn Festival? No. Li Yi said very simply. This wine was used to make floral water to repel mosquitoes. He could not let Fang spoil it. Fang's expression froze and he was speechless for a moment. Ignoring the bitterness in Fang's eyes, Li Yi opened his mouth again and said, Go find some iron pots and some empty bamboo tubes. We're about to start working. Li Yi originally wanted to postpone the purification of the alcohol for a while and make the soap first. However, his plans could not keep up with the changes, so he had to put the purification of the alcohol first. There was no other reason. To make a mosquito-repellent floral water, it was necessary to use a high concentration of alcohol. Fang was very efficient. He found the iron pot very quickly. Under Li Yi's guidance, it took him half a day to build the alcohol distillation device. Distilling alcohol was not as simple as heating it in a pot. If the temperature was too high, the alcohol and water would evaporate together. After condensing, the alcohol would still be of a low concentration, and it would not be purified. This was a simple distillation device. It first heated the water and used the water temperature to evaporate the alcohol. The alcohol vapor condensed above and entered the bamboo tube. What flowed out was the purified alcohol. Li Yi could easily find the schematic diagram of the distillation device in the book, but the equipment such as flasks and glass tubes could not be realized at present. In desperation, he could only settle for the next best thing and replace it with these simple things in front of him. Although the effect would definitely be a lot worse as long as he could get alcohol with a concentration of more than 75%, it would be enough. After all the preparations were done, Li Yi ignited the flame below. The next thing to do was to wait. Fang scratched his head. He looked at Li Yi for a while, and then looked at the strange thing his son-in-law asked him to make. His brain was a mess. As drops of wine flowed out of the hollow bamboo tube, gradually the kitchen began to fill with a strong wine aroma. Gulp. Fang swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Li Yi turned his head and glanced at him. Fang immediately wiped the corner of his mouth and looked away from the bowl under the bamboo tube, pretending that nothing had happened. When the speed of the wine flowing out of the bamboo tube became extremely slow, Li Yi knew that the wine in the pot was almost distilled. He took out a chopstick and dipped it into the bowl. After tasting it, he frowned slightly. Although the alcohol content after distilling was much higher than before, it still did not meet his requirements. It seems that this distillation device is still too simple. If I want to produce it on a large scale in the future and increase the efficiency, I need to improve the distillation device. Li Yi murmured. He poured all the distilled wine into an empty jar and replaced it with fresh wine for the second distillation. Smelling the fragrance in the air, Fang's throat kept trembling. He wanted to pick up the jar next to him and drink to his heart's content. However, he thought that this wine would definitely be of great use to his son-in-law, so he restrained this thought. The alcohol content after distilling was far from enough. The device was simple and crude, and he had to make up for the number of times. Li Yi repeated the distillation over and over again. This way the alcohol content would increase a little every time. According to the book, Using the distillation method to distill alcohol could only achieve a maximum alcohol concentration of about 95%. Of course, it was impossible for Li Yi to achieve such a high alcohol concentration with a few broken pots, but 80% was enough for him. After repeated distillation a few times, Li Yi found that the alcohol content did not increase much. Only then did he give up. Gulp. Fong, who was beside him, swallowed a mouthful of saliva again. Glancing at Fong, Li Yi really could not stand it anymore. He divided a small bowl of distilled alcohol and handed it to him. "Alright, don't be greedy. Have a taste of this wine." Hearing this, Fong's eyes lit up. After taking the bowl, he couldn't wait to drink it. Li Yi watched as Fong's face turned from black to red. He let out a comfortable moan. The expression on his face was extremely satisfied. He said loudly, "Good wine." Blah. After saying these two words, Fong's body swayed a few times and fell to the ground, unconscious. Looking at Fong, who was lying on the ground and snoring, Li Yi could not help but feel some contempt in his heart. This guy looked so strong, but it turned out that he was also an embroidered pillow. One gulp and he was not much stronger than himself. Putting the distilled alcohol to the tip of his nose and smelling it, a spicy smell rushed straight into his lungs. In just an instant, Li Yi felt a little dizzy. He quickly moved the wine bowl away. At this time, he realized that the alcohol in front of him was more than 75% alcohol concentration. In the previous world, alcohol with a concentration higher than 60% seemed to be prohibited from being sold in the country. Looking down at Fong, who was lying on the ground, Li could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth. "You're already an adult, but you still can't resist the temptation. You deserve it." Chapter 59. Fong was carried back to his home by Li Yi's men. When he was carried away, he kept muttering, "Good wine." Li Yi clearly noticed that the two men's eyes lit up when they smelled the wine on Fong. At that time, Li Yi mocked Fong a little in his heart, but it didn't take long for him to regret it. He really shouldn't have tricked Fong into drinking the wine. That was a high concentration of more than 75% alcohol. If he didn't sleep until tomorrow morning, it was estimated that Fong wouldn't wake up. If he didn't wake up, Li Yi would have to do the next work alone. Bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices. Grind all of these things into powder, then put the distilled alcohol in a porcelain bottle and mixed it with the ground powder. Then shake the porcelain bottle continuously to ensure that they were mixed well. Both bezoar and honeysuckle had the effect of clearing heat and detoxifying. The function of mint was mainly used to repel mosquitoes. As for those spices, of course, it was to make the scent of the floral water smell better. This was a simple preparation method of floral water that Li Yi found in the book. In terms of effect, it was certainly not comparable to the big brands such as Lucien or Longlicky in the future, but Li Yi's requirements were not high, as long as the mosquito repellent effect was okay. According to the book, the concentration of 75% alcohol was mixed with powdered bezoar, honeysuckle, peppermint, and so on, and then kept shaking for half an hour. After they were fully mixed, the residue was filtered out, and the simple floral water was successfully prepared. Thus, when the servant girl came to the kitchen, she saw the son-in-law holding a porcelain bottle in his hand. He looked as if he was possessed, shaking it back and forth. "Son-in-law, what's wrong with you?" The little maid ran over in a hurry and looked at Li Yi with eyes full of worry. If the son-in-law was really possessed, what could he do? Even an iron man would not be able to withstand such a long period of shaking. Just as Li Yi was feeling a little dizzy and nauseous, Xiao Huan's figure appeared at the right time. "Xiao Huan, come here quickly and help me shake this bottle." With Xiao Huan's help, he could finally rest for a while. Li Yi looked at the little maid who stood there shaking the porcelain bottle stupidly and did not know what had happened. He thought to himself that when he prepared the floral dew on a large scale in the future, he had to think of a reliable way to ensure that they were fully integrated. It was not a long-term solution to hold the bottle and shake it every time. The two of them took turns, and after about half an hour, Li Yi estimated that it was about time. He pulled out the cork and passed the liquid inside the bottle through a piece of clean gauze to remove the undissolved residue. After the filtration, a translucent liquid was obtained. At the same time, a familiar fragrance began to fill the room. "Young master, what is this? It smells so good." The young maidservant widened her eyes and looked at Li Yi in surprise. "It seems that there are a little too many spices. Next time, reduce the amount by 1/3. Li Yi murmured and put the first successfully prepared floral dew in a new porcelain bottle. The first preparation of floral dew was relatively successful. Although there were inevitably some flaws, as long as he did a few more experiments, he would always be able to find the most suitable formula. Li Yi could not wait to experiment with the efficacy of the floral dew he prepared. Xiao Huan, hurry up and boil water. I want to take a bath later. Yes, young master. The young maidservant looked at the strange thing in the kitchen with some doubts and looked at the back of Li Yi, who left with some joy. Her heart was full of curiosity. What did the son-in-law come up with this time? He poured some floral dew into the bathtub and took a comfortable hot bath. He immediately felt refreshed and his body exuded a faint fragrance. In order to verify the mosquito repellent effect, Li Yi stayed in the corner of the room with the most mosquitoes for a while. The mosquitoes that were willing to be intimate with him were really much less than before. Success. Seeing the mosquito repellent effect of floral dew, Li Yi's face showed joy. This showed that the method of using floral dew to repel mosquitoes was feasible. Next time he could add more mosquito repellent herbs like peppermint to get floral dew with a stronger mosquito repellent effect. Similarly, if he modified the formula and thought more about the spices, wouldn't the end result be perfume? This was simply killing two birds with one stone. However, for the promotion of floral dew and perfume in this world, Li Yi still did not have much confidence in his heart at this time. In the past he had read many time travel novels. The protagonists invented various modern items in the ancient world with knowledge that was hundreds and thousands of years ahead of the ancients. They were very popular with the ancients. They counted money until their hands cramped. They had beautiful wives and concubines, big houses, groups of servants, and lived a luxurious and extravagant life. However, Li Yi, who had real experience, deeply understood that reality was far more painful than ideals. Some things were very simple to think about, but when it was really realized, all kinds of difficulties would come one after another. What he needed to do now was to improve the alcohol purification device as much as possible. If the efficiency of each distillation was as low as the first time, it would never work. In addition, he also needed to build a separate processing workshop. After all, he couldn't always do it in his own kitchen. Moreover, after the scale of production was expanded, the small space in the kitchen was far from meeting the requirements. Fortunately, Li Yi still needed some time to improve the distillation equipment and improve the formula. The construction of the workshop was not so urgent. What's more, the location of the workshop, how to build it, and how to operate it after it was built had to be decided after careful consideration. Of course, Li Yi couldn't do these things alone. Therefore he asked Fang and the others to get out of the candied haws business as soon as possible. Just by selling a few sticks of candied haws, Fang's dream of marrying a concubine and buying a village would probably only be realized in his next life. Li Yi felt that he was born to work hard. He was living a good life as the husband of the village. He had food, drinks, and maids to serve him every day. His life was extremely comfortable. However, he had to look for trouble and lead Fang and the others to a well-off life. He obviously yearned for a pig's life, but in the end he was as tired as a dog. This was all his own doing. When he walked out of the room, he saw the little maid sitting in the yard. She pouted and kept scratching the mosquito bite on her arm. Hearing the son-in-law calling her from a distance at the door, the girl hurriedly stood up, turned her head and asked, "Son-in-law, what's the matter?" Come here, come here." He waved to the little maid and brought her into the room. He poured some floral water on his hand and wiped it on the mosquito bite on her arm. He asked, "How do you feel? Is it still itchy?" "No, it's not itchy anymore." The afterglow of the setting sun shone into the room through the window. The little maid rolled up her sleeves, revealing her white arms. She lowered her head and spoke softly. Her pretty face was rosy and beautiful. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.